Meanwhile, in David's mansion, the 6 guardians were restless while watching the news on television, especially David. David scratched his head over the new problem caused by Vasper, who had involved Chanty's name. The television showed footage from a cell phone recording, capturing Vasper being assisted from his wrecked sports car, repeatedly mentioning Chanty Lorenzo's name while being helped by medics. The situation sparked curiosity among the people, as the severely damaged car seemed too destroyed for anyone to survive. This heightened the mystery surrounding Vasper's identity. Vasper had drawn public attention, the very thing David and the others were trying to avoid, so that the world wouldn't learn the truth about their abilities, proving they weren't ordinary people. However, Vasper had already made headlines multiple times due to his involvement in underground racing and his dangerous stunts. Since his breakup with Chanty, Vasper seemed to spiral out of control, participating in every extreme sport, making the news repeatedly. That guy is unbelievable. I feel like punching him in the face. I'd love to finish him off. Jacob shouted. His body trembled with anger at Vasper. Why did he have to drag Chanty's name into this? What if Samara's family sees this? What will they think of Chanty? Especially if Samara sees it, she's pregnant. This could affect her and her baby because of what Vasper did. The 6 of them glared at one another. My biggest concern is that this will reach Alexander Mondragon and the Sylvan Concord. We might get summoned to the inner world, David said, sitting on the sofa with his elbows resting on his knees, staring at the floor. The other 5 looked at David, sighing as they glanced at each other. It would be a major issue if the Sylvan Concord heard about this and launched an investigation into Vasper and Chanty. The Guardians, especially David, would surely face consequences. Justin, call Jake and tell him I need him here for an emergency meeting. Bring Chanty with him, David instructed Justin, who had the ability to communicate with Jake telepathically. Justin did as told in front of David, concentrating to send the message to Jake. They all kept watching the TV. Another piece of footage came up, intriguing David. A CCTV recording from a restaurant in Paris, France, involving Vasper Mondragon and Princess Samara. They saw 4 people emerge from an elevator. Jake and Chanty were almost running toward their car, while Vasper Mondragon chased after Chanty Lorenzo, and Samara followed after Vasper. They observed Jake's swift movement as he opened the car. Then, they saw Vasper catching up to Chanty, grabbing her arm, but Chanty yanked it away, and Jake pushed Vasper hard, sending him flying. There seemed to be a conversation, but the CCTV had no audio. They also saw Samara confront Jake, but Chanty pulled Jake into the car. They quickly exited the garage. Jake's car's plate number was visible, and the last thing they saw was Vasper angrily kicking his car before glaring at the CCTV camera. Samara cried as she watched Vasper. It was like a drama unfolding before their eyes. David's eyes glowed even more intensely. No one spoke. How did they meet in Paris? Marco asked. Wow. What just happened? How are we going to fix this? Can we even fix this? Marco added, while another guardian said, Prepare yourself, David. You'll be blamed for all of this. It's your fault for letting Chanty be with Jake, Jacob interjected, upset at David for letting Jake take care of Chanty. David fell silent, knowing he was partly responsible. He had relied too much on Jake's abilities, but he also knew that Jake and Chanty didn't intend to meet Vasper at that restaurant. Prepare yourselves for a summons from the Sylvan Concord, Jacob said as he turned and left the mansion. Meanwhile, David exchanged glances with Gabriel and Louis. Justin and Marco looked at David with concern. They were worried that if the Sylvan Concord got involved in this mess, Chanty would not like their decision. David stood up, his body tense, pacing back and forth in the living room. His fists clenched, his face filled with worry. He felt furious with Vasper. Vasper had lost his sanity due to his overwhelming love for Chanty, and now they were all being dragged into deeper trouble. Based on what they saw in the CCTV footage in the parking lot, something seemed to have changed between Jake and Chanty. Could it be possible that the two were now in a relationship? David thought. The last thing he saw was Chanty kissing Jake. There was a possibility that they were now a couple. Justin, don't stop trying to reach Jake. He and Chanty need to get here now. And bring Lorena along so she can visit her family, even if just for a short time, David added. Justin nodded. You know Jake is stubborn, Justin responded. But suddenly, they were all startled by the abrupt arrival of Jake, who had brought Chanty and Lorena with him. Everyone stared in shock, and Lorena smiled as she walked to the kitchen to meet Samuel. Chanty, dressed in a white polo shirt and skinny jeans, still looked as beautiful as ever. Jake, in a white shirt that clung to his muscular torso, leather pants, and slippers, stood beside her. What they didn't expect was to see Jake and Chanty holding hands. Everyone stared at Jake and Chanty, speechless, unable to believe what they were seeing. Jacob, who had just returned to the mansion, stood in the hallway, watching them, also stunned as he approached the living room. David was the first to recover, already anticipating this scene. Chanty looked at the guardians seriously, knowing they would be shocked by the change in the situation. Jake silently led Chanty to the sofa, where they sat next to each other. David sat across from them, while the other 5 guardians remained in disbelief, unable to recover from the surprise of Jake and Chanty holding hands. Jacob stared seriously at Jake, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. How? The last thing he knew, Chanty despised Jake. She couldn't even look at his face because of her anger and fear. But now, they were holding hands like a couple. Was this another problem? Jacob thought. Jake, can you explain the change we're seeing now? We're all shocked by this, David asked. We know what happened with Vasper and Samara, but we never expected you and Chanty. David trailed off as Jake interrupted. Yes, David, you're right. Your suspicions are correct. Chanty and I are together now, Jake said, looking them directly in the eyes, his voice serious and resolute. He glanced at Chanty, and she, in turn, held Jake's arm tightly. Jake's hands rested on Chanty's lap. Louis, Gabriel, and Marco were all left gaping, mouths open. This was a huge shift from the last time they had all met on Vasper's yacht. Then again, Vasper had gotten Samara pregnant. But they never expected Jake and Chanty. They thought Jake was just protecting Chanty at his mansion. But Jacob remained silent, his expression serious as he stared at Jake. Jake and Jacob locked eyes, a silent confrontation between them, as if measuring each other's strength or resolve. David noticed the tension and interrupted their unspoken battle. Chanty looked at David, and David gazed back at her with a somber expression. Chanty, Jake, we have a new problem. Look at the news on the TV, David began. Jake clenched his fists, his face suddenly becoming very serious as he stared at David. David turned the TV back on and switched to the news, and Chanty and Jake saw Vasper's accident, where he was repeatedly mentioning Chanty's name. Chanty, who was watching, felt her heartbeat quicken, confused by the mix of emotions she was experiencing. Her worry for Vasper was present, but so was fear for his life, especially when he was uttering her name. Jake watched Chanty's face, reading her reaction, as did everyone else, even Jacob, carefully observing how Chanty would react to Vasper. Chanty, however, managed to calm herself down in front of them, reminding herself that Vasper had healing powers and could heal himself. Besides, he now had a wife who was pregnant. Even if they weren't married yet, she was the one who had the right to be there for Vasper at the hospital, not her. Chanty then glanced at Jake, masking her true emotions. But what really concerned Chanty was why Vasper had mentioned her name. What if Samara's family saw it? David, Chanty began, clearly anxious about the potential backlash from Vasper's actions. David simply looked down. Meanwhile, Jake was furious at Vasper, clenching his fists in anger over what Vasper had done. That's not all, Jake, David added. Wait until you see the footage from the restaurant. Chanty and Jake's eyes widened as they continued watching the TV, waiting for the restaurant footage to appear. Moments later, the scene unfolded, and Chanty looked down after seeing it. Jake took her hand and held it tightly between his 2 hands. I'm so sorry. None of this would have happened if I hadn't brought you there to eat, Jake said, his voice filled with regret. Chanty, with tears streaming down her face, looked at Jake. The 6 guardians, meanwhile, were still in shock over the new development they were witnessing. It hadn't yet sunk in that Jake and Chanty were now a couple. It was no longer Vasper who was with Chanty. "Chanty, we understand what happened between you and Vasper," Marco said. "But from that day on the yacht until now, it's hard to believe that you and Jake are a couple. I mean, it seems impossible." "Sorry, Jake, but we can't believe it," Lewis added. Jake remained serious, looking at Chanty as he listened to the Guardians' reactions. He couldn't blame them, even he had trouble believing it at first. They all felt the same way. Jake then looked at Marco. "I understand, Marco. Even now, it feels like a dream to me, so I don't blame you," Jake replied. Everyone chuckled awkwardly, except Chanty, who looked at Jake. Jake, in turn, gazed back at Chanty, his eyes filled with love. David, releasing a sigh, said, "Do you realize, Jake, that we have a huge problem to deal with now?" Silence fell over the room. Meanwhile, Jake and Jacob exchanged intense looks. "Your relationship won't survive if the Sylvan Concord gets involved, Jake," Jacob stated bluntly. Chanty was shocked by what she heard, while Jake remained silent, gripping Shanta's hand even tighter. Shanta looked at Jake, her eyes filled with questions, and then at David. David sighed deeply. "Pray that the Sylvan Concord doesn't get involved, Jake. You know what will happen to Chanty and you if they do, don't you?" David added. Shanta's anxiety worsened after hearing that. "Why, David? What's going on?" Chanty asked, worried. Jake looked at her, his face filled with concern. "Chanty, prepare yourself to face the consequences of what Vasper did, dragging your name into this. We don't know how it will affect the public or how Samara's family will react," David said. Chanty felt like she was floating, overwhelmed by yet another problem involving Vasper. When would she ever escape the shadow of Vasper and Samara? But her concern for Vasper was still present. She kept reminding herself that she had no right to feel that way. She wasn't Vasper's wife, Samara was. Surely Samara was already taking care of him at the hospital, and Vasper might even be recovering thanks to his healing powers. But as for Jake, what did Jacob mean by what he said? Marco and Justin exchanged glances, as did the other Guardians. Jake continued to stare at Jacob, who was still serious, his look filled with meaning directed at Chanty and Jake. Jacob still couldn't believe Chanty and Jake's relationship. The conversation between David and the others lasted for a long time. Finally, David asked to speak to Jake alone, without Chanty. Chanty respected the request and headed to her old room, but before she went, she and Jake embraced, sharing a brief kiss. The Guardians' jaws dropped even further. One by one, they turned away, but David acted as if it were no big deal. He had expected it. Jacob remained stoic. "Wait for me there," Jake told Chanty. She nodded and left for her room. When Chanty entered the room, she felt a wave of nostalgia wash over her as memories of Vasper flooded back, memories in the room, the bed, even the bathroom. Tears streamed down her face. No matter how hard she tried, Vasper remained deep in her heart. But she prioritized her mind, making decisions that were best for her and those around her. As she sat on the bed, she listened to the noise outside in the living room. At least David didn't know that she had a hearing capabilities. She listened intently to David's conversation with Jake. Every word David spoke felt like a knife in Shanta's heart. Her tears flowed as she listened to David's words to Jake. However, she didn't hear any response from Jake. Chanty covered her mouth, continuing to listen. Would that really be their fate if the Sylvan Concord intervened? Why? They had just begun their relationship, and now this problem had appeared out of nowhere. What should she do? What should she and Jake do? She had vowed that Jake would be the last man in her life and the father of her children. When Jake and David's conversation ended, Chanty wiped her tears, composing herself so Jake wouldn't notice. She heard David invite everyone to stay for lunch and dinner, offering to drop Lorena off to visit her family before returning to Jake's mansion. Suddenly, Jake materialized in Shanta's room. The moment Jake appeared, Chanty immediately embraced him, and Jake hugged her back tightly. They kissed fervently, as if Chanty had been longing for Jake due to what she had overheard. Jake felt the same way. Their kiss was filled with longing, as if they were about to be separated at that moment. "I love you so much, Chanty," Jake said against her lips. Chanty responded with, "I love you too, Jake," through a soft moan. They continued kissing until they were both lying on the bed. In the heat of their kisses, they began to undress each other. Chanty removed Jake's shirt, and Jake slowly unbuttoned Shanta's blouse. Jake's lips trailed along Shanta's neck as he slowly unbuttoned her blouse, while Chanty clung to his neck. But just as they were lost in the moment, a knock sounded at the door. Both froze in place. "Miss Chanty, I'm leaving now, and lunch is ready at the dining table," Lorena called out, knocking politely to inform them she was going home to see her family before returning to Jake's mansion later that evening. Chanty signaled that she was getting up. Jake helped her to her feet, and they both smiled as they quickly got dressed again. "Okay, Lorena, I'll be out in a moment," Chanty called back as Jake assisted her with the buttons of her blouse. They exchanged another kiss before she straightened her hair and clothes. Together, they exited the room, catching Lorena by surprise when she saw Jake. She had assumed only Chanty was inside. "I'm sorry, Sir Jake, Miss Chanty. Did I interrupt something?" "I thought you were alone," Lorena apologized, clearly embarrassed by her intrusion. Chanty smiled warmly. "It's all right, Lorena. We were just heading to the dining table," she replied. Jake reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and handed Lorena a thick stack of bills without even counting them. "Take this, Lorena. Give it to your family before you return later," he said. Lorena gratefully accepted the money, tucking it into her shoulder bag. Marco then offered to drive her to see her family, and they left together. Meanwhile, Chanty and Jake made their way to the dining table, where Jake pulled out a chair for her before sitting down beside her. The other guardians watched them closely, their eyes filled with curiosity. Louis chuckled. "Sorry, but I still can't wrap my head around this, after everything that happened on the yacht, to see you two together now. Did you cast a spell on Chanty, Jake?" Louis joked, still finding the situation hard to believe. Jake and Chanty exchanged smiles. "That's all in the past, Louis. I don't want to keep bringing it up," Chanty replied, though it was clear she was still affected by what had transpired between her and Vasper. Louis apologized. "Sorry, Chanty." As they ate, it became apparent that all eyes were on Jake and Chanty. Even Jacob stared at them intensely, as if trying to x-ray them with his gaze. Fortune seemed to favor Jake in this situation. "By the way, congratulations to both of you on your relationship," Gabriel remarked. "With Jake, at least you don't have to worry, unlike with Vasper." They all finished their meal, and Jake's hand rested gently on Shanta's thigh. She didn't mind, letting his hand stay there. "But Chanty, you should still be cautious." Plenty of women still noticed Jake, Justin teased with a grin. "But he's all yours." Jake and Shanta smiled at each other again, their lips magnetically drawn together for a brief kiss. The guardians looked on, amused by how sweet the couple was, except for Jacob, who remained stoic as he observed the scene between Jake and Chanty. Once the meal ended, David invited Jake to his office. Chanty and Jake grew serious as they followed David's lead. Chanty remained in the living room while Jake followed David into his office. Shanta strained her ears, trying to listen to their conversation, but she couldn't hear anything. Was David's office soundproof? While Chanty waited in the living room, she sat with Justin, Gabriel, Louis, and Jacob. Jacob turned to her and asked, "Chanty, can I see the Sword of Destiny?" Everyone looked at Jacob, surprised by his request. Shanta studied his expression, trying to read his thoughts. She understood why he wanted to see the sword. Without hesitation, Chanty extended her hand, and the Sword of Destiny materialized in her palm. She waved it gracefully in front of Jacob while still seated. The guardians laughed as they looked at Jacob. "See, Jacob? She's still a virgin, don't worry," Gabriel teased with a laugh. Jacob leaned back in his chair, seemingly satisfied after seeing the sword. The guardians remained in awe of the legendary weapon Chanty held. Then, with a mere thought, the sword disappeared from her hand. Chanty grew more curious about what David and Jake were discussing in the office. "What is the Sylvan Concord?" she asked, breaking the silence. Everyone exchanged uneasy glances. It took a while before anyone responded. "They are the ones who enforce the laws of the inner world, Chanty. Alexander Mondragon is the only one not under their jurisdiction. He's beyond their control. They are also the keepers of the pact made between your parents, sealed with your mother's blood. We were assigned to watch over you here in the outer world until the time of the Twilight Reckoning." "The Twilight Reckoning?" Chanty echoed. "This event marks the one time when Alexander Mondragon can be challenged and possibly defeated. It happens once every millennium, when the forces of the inner world and outer world align under a rare celestial event. During this time, the barriers between the realms are at their thinnest, and Alexander's powers are slightly weakened. It is your only chance, our only chance, to strike at Alexander." Chanty, seemingly out of touch with her own body, was overwhelmed by the revelation. How was she supposed to process this new information? "When is the Twilight Reckoning?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "In 3 months, right after the blood moon. By that time, you must be ready, Chanty. We all must be ready. But everything changed when you fell in love. And now, these men surrounding you are going crazy over your beauty, like moths being burned by the fire. Look at the mess we're in, problems stacking up because of these men falling for you," Justin said bluntly, his words lacking any restraint, leaving Chanty speechless. Jacob, on the other hand, couldn't even look at her, clearly embarrassed. Just then, Jake arrived, and everyone's attention turned to him. Chanty noticed the serious look in his eyes, and instantly, she could tell something was wrong. She approached him, took his hands, and stared deeply into his eyes. "Jake, what is it?" "What's wrong?" she asked, but the room fell silent as they exchanged glances. Everyone knew what troubled Jake, except for Chanty. David sat down heavily, sighing deeply. Moments later, Marco's car pulled up, as Samuel opened the gate. They watched through the glass wall as Marco exited the vehicle, looking distressed. "David," Marco called, breathless, as David stood and met him at the door. Marco's face was filled with worry as he stepped inside. "Lorena." "Vasper took her," Marco announced, his words causing everyone's eyes to widen in shock. "What? Why? Where did he take her?" David demanded, alarmed. "The demon escaped from the hospital?" Jacob exclaimed, adding to the tension in the room. Chanty, deep down, felt a strange relief that Vasper was free. At least it meant he was all right. But worry gnawed at her. Why had Vasper taken Lorena? Jake clenched his fists, visibly angry, prompting Chanty to hold his hand in an attempt to calm him. "Maybe he wants to get to you through Lorena," Jake speculated, but in his mind, he knew Vasper could have easily tracked Chanty by the bra she had left behind at his house. Why would he need Lorena? "I overheard him when he took her," Marco continued. "I was already in the car, heading back here, when I sensed his energy and heard his voice. He was talking to Lorena, asking for a few hours to complete something. He promised to return her right after. That's all I heard before he vanished with her." "I have no idea where he took her," Marco explained further, leaving David puzzled. "What about Lorena's family? How are they?" David asked. "They haven't arrived home yet. Lorena was the only one there when she was taken," Marco responded. Chanty saw Vasper standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by the 6 guardians. Their stances were alert, serious, and shocked, their eyes flickering between Chanty and the unfolding scene. It felt like the roles had been reversed. Once it was Vasper who held Chanty close, but now it was Jake embracing her. The guardians glanced back and forth between Chanty and Vasper. Jake's body was tense, his grip on Chanty firm and protective. Both of his arms wrapped tightly around her as Chanty trembled, pressing herself into Jake's chest. She clung to him with all her strength, terrified that Vasper might suddenly tear her away from Jake's arms again. Vasper and Jake locked eyes in a deadly silence, their gazes filled with a tension that could kill. David was the first to break the stillness. "Vasper, it's good you're here. Where did you take Lorena?" David's voice was calm, but his eyes remained fixed on Vasper, whose gaze had not yet left Jake. Both men stood tall, their faces hard and their eyes sharp. "I just took Lorena for a moment, David. I needed to clean up the room Chanty and I used at the island beach house," Vasper replied, his tone firm but clear, as if he were in denial. Despite everything, it seemed he still couldn't accept that Chanty was no longer his. When Chanty heard his words, she froze, a deep sadness clouding her eyes. She didn't want to be reminded of their room, or the memories she and Vasper shared on the island. David, however, gave a smile. "Oh, is that so? That's good news, Vasper. So you're cleaning out the room to get rid of Shanta's things and replace them with Samara's? At least that's a sign both sides are moving on," David said, emphasizing his point. Vasper shot him an angry glare. "Nothing in that room changes, David. Not a single thing. Nothing will be replaced. Do you understand?" Vasper's voice was harsh and resolute, sending shockwaves through everyone, especially Jake and Chanty. Jake's jaw clenched with rage, the muscles in his face twitching as he stared at Vasper. Chanty felt a deep unease hearing Vasper's words. She no longer wanted to hear his voice. "Jake, can we go home now?" Chanty whispered softly, only for Jake to hear. He heard her, but before he could respond, Vasper shouted, "No one is leaving, Chanty." Vasper's voice was angry, startling everyone. Lewis immediately tensed, readying his telekinesis in case he needed to control Vasper. The Guardians all took defensive positions, prepared for a fight. Shanta's tears began to fall, her fear rising. Jake's body remained rigid, refusing to let go of her, afraid Vasper would try to take her again. Part of him longed to attack Vasper. "I swear, Vasper. You should be the one to leave." Jake growled through clenched teeth. "Vasper, isn't it enough what you did in Japan? Did you watch the news?" David's voice was sharp. "Your actions are impacting Chanty. People are starting to think she's your mistress. What the hell is wrong with you?" David rebuked Vasper. Vasper barely glanced at David before returning his gaze to Jake. His voice dropped dangerously low. "Let go of Chanty, Jake," Vasper commanded, his tone deadly serious. The Guardian's eyes glowed with tension. "Vasper, Chanty is Jake's girlfriend. Not yours," Justin shouted, his voice echoing through the room. Chanty heard it, and her fear only deepened. Jake's grip tightened even more. "Vasper, have you lost your mind? You're about to have a child with Samara. Your wedding is next, isn't it? Everyone who knows you is aware of this. Leave Chanty and Jake's relationship alone," Jacob added, his anger barely restrained. Jake looked at Jacob in surprise, not expecting his support. But Vasper only laughed, a mad sound that fueled Jake's fury even more. Chanty, meanwhile, felt her heart sink further into despair. "Jake, let's go." "Don't listen to him anymore," Chanty pleaded softly. She looked up at Jake, her eyes begging for his understanding. But Vasper heard her voice. "Where will you go? To your room with the gold ceiling and large glass windows? The one with the swimming pool outside?" Vasper's words indicated he already knew about Jake's mansion. Jake wasn't surprised. The Guardian's eyes flared with worry. It was useless to hide from Vasper, he had already figured out their location. Chanty, overwhelmed with fear and anger, turned toward Vasper. Her gaze was full of hurt, but Vasper's expression softened when he saw her look at him. He was elated that she had acknowledged him at all. "Chanty, I'm sorry for what I did. I regret it more than you know," Vasper pleaded, his voice filled with desperation for the woman he loved most. "Vasper, stay away from me, please. I beg you, give me freedom. Give me peace like I did for you." Shanta's voice was full of anger, making sure Vasper understood her words. But Vasper seemed shattered by her response. "Chanty, I don't want freedom from you. Didn't I tell you before? Don't let go of me, no matter what trials lie ahead." Vasper's voice was fragile, almost childlike, as he faced Chanty. Those around him were stunned. No one could believe what had become of Vasper because of his love for Chanty. Vasper. Enough. It's over between us. Please, stop bothering me, Chanty insisted, her voice cracking with frustration. Tears welled up in Vasper's eyes, and the guardians began to panic at the sight. Jake's blue flame flickered at his fingertips, ready to strike. Chanty. Believe me, I don't love Samara. I'm a victim of a setup by Laika and Samara. They used magic wine against me. Please, tell me what I can do to earn your forgiveness. I'll do anything. Vasper pleaded, falling to his knees in front of Chanty. The guardians froze in shock. No one expected Vasper to kneel before her. Jake's anger only intensified, seeing that Vasper still wouldn't give Chanty up. Shanty's heart grew heavier, watching the man who had impregnated another woman now kneeling before her with such audacity. The guardians couldn't bear to look, they turned away in discomfort. Jake, his eyes burning into Vasper, spoke with bitter determination. Vasper. I'm the one begging now. What do I need to do for you to leave me alone? Understand my situation. Shanty's tears flowed, her voice filled with desperation. Jake gently wiped them away with his fingers, his other arm still holding her close. Don't touch her, Jake. Vasper screamed, his anger boiling over. Jake nearly attacked him, but Chanty held him back. Please, don't, just leave me alone. She whispered, her plea aimed at both men, knowing Jake understood her. But Vasper's fury only grew. Vasper. If you don't listen and cooperate, we will hand Chanty over to the Sylvan Concord. David's sudden words left everyone stunned, especially Vasper. Chanty too was shocked, but Jake felt a sharp pain in his chest as he heard it. His grip on Chanty tightened protectively, and he kissed the top of her head. Jake, can we please go to the room? Chanty pleaded, her knees weakening, unable to stand any longer. She felt her body growing weaker and uncomfortable. Vasper's hands clenched into fists as he looked at David and then at Chanty. It felt as if his heart was being ripped apart as he watched Jake holding Chanty close. He wanted to lash out, to scream, but the guardians just observed his every move carefully, waiting. David, we'll go to Chanty's room. I'll still be able to hear everything from there. She needs to relax, Jake said, directing his gaze at David. David nodded in approval, though his eyes lingered on Vasper. Vasper's jaw clenched harder, but before anyone could react, Jake and Chanty disappeared from the room, reappearing inside Chanty's bedroom. Jake gently laid Chanty down on the bed. Chanty, still holding his hand, pulled him down to sit beside her. Jake listened intently to the conversation in the living room as David spoke. Chanty, I love you, Jake whispered softly, so only she could hear. He knew Vasper was likely listening, his ears attuned to their every word. I love you too, Jake. Please, lie down next to me, Chanty whispered back, her voice pleading. Jake smiled and lay beside her, enveloping her in his arms. She moaned softly, relaxing into his embrace. Jake held her tighter as she rested her head on his arm. I love you, Jake, Chanty said, tears starting to spill from her eyes. Jake looked at her, his eyes filled with love and concern. I love you more, Chanty, he replied, and they shared a passionate kiss. I always will, he added, his lips brushing hers. As they kissed, they suddenly heard Vasper raging outside in the living room. The outburst abruptly stopped. Jake knew Vasper was still listening in on them, hanging on every word, and it made Chanty's heart harden even further against him. They heard the conversation continuing outside, though David was the only one speaking now. Lewis must have been using his telekinesis to keep Vasper under control. Jake, what if they take me to Sylvan Concord? Chanty asked, looking into Jake's eyes. He smiled gently. Then we won't see each other again, but they'll take care of you for 3 years, Jake explained softly. Chanty was stunned. Can I not refuse their laws? She asked, desperation in her voice. No, Jake answered quietly. The agreement was signed in blood by your parents when you were born. They will honor it. If we fail in our duties to protect you, they will take over. Jake's words were firm, and Shanty's tears flowed more freely. Jake, will I not see you for those 3 years? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake shook his head, his throat tightening as if a bone were lodged in it. Chanty hugged Jake tightly, as if she could pull him into her soul. Both of them felt their happiness slipping away, as if ripped from their hearts. Jake's tears began to fall too. I'll miss you so much, Jake, Chanty said, her voice breaking. Jake's response was a deep, warm kiss. Chanty returned the kiss, equally full of longing, like two souls starved for each other's love. Their kisses grew more intense, filled with unspoken declarations of love and passion. Shanty's soft moans filled the room, and their bodies heated with desire, but Jake knew they couldn't go any further. Vasper was still out there, likely listening to every breath they took. Jake smiled between kisses, knowing how loud they were. Shanty's hand slipped under Jake's briefs, making him tense. He wrapped his arms tightly around her, whispering in her ear, "Not now. They'll hear us." Shanty smiled back and nodded slowly, but she didn't remove her hand, continuing to caress Jake. He grabbed a blanket and covered them both. Chanty, still playing with him under the sheets, felt Jake's body grow more tense. His breathing grew heavier, and they kissed again, lips locked in heated passion. She clung to his arms. Suddenly, they heard Vasper scream from the living room. Jake heard Justin's voice in his mind, speaking telepathically, "Jake. You idiot. Can you and Chanty stop what you're doing? We can hear everything down here. Damn you, Vasper's already going crazy." Jake felt like he had just been doused in cold water. "They can hear us," Jake muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. Gently, he pulled Shanty's hand away. They exchanged soft kisses, then embraced tightly, listening to the conversation continuing outside. David was still speaking, and it seemed like Lewis had taken control over Vasper again. In the living room, Vasper and David sat in tense conversation. They had come to an agreement: Vasper would no longer interfere with Chanty and Jake. They both agreed that, as much as possible, there should be no trouble between them. Vasper also had to accept that he no longer had any right to Chanty. They were no longer a couple. Though Vasper's heart raged against this decision, he accepted it in exchange for one condition: he would have the freedom to visit David's house without being questioned or stalked, as long as he showed no hostility. Should any disturbance arise from this agreement, David himself would surrender Chanty to Sylvan Concord, believing he could no longer protect her from chaos and danger, something Vasper feared most of all. If that happened, Vasper knew he wouldn't be able to see Chanty for 3 long years. Lewis, using his telekinesis, released his hold on Vasper. Vasper stared at David seriously, though his ears were tuned to the room where Chanty and Jake were. The room was silent, he heard nothing. David then called Chanty and Jake to join them in the living room to clarify their arrangement. Without delay, Chanty and Jake appeared, hand in hand. Chanty focused on David, avoiding Vasper's gaze, while Vasper, lips tight, stared intensely at her. Jake, on the other hand, simply observed Vasper. There was nothing Jake could do now. It was clear that Vasper had to accept that Chanty was with him. The guardians in the room shook their heads, witnessing the drastic shift in dynamics between the trio. It was such a stark contrast from what had happened in the past. Justin telepathically nudged Jake, telling him to fix Shanty's blouse since 3 buttons had come undone. Jake glanced quickly at Shanty's blouse and, without drawing attention, buttoned it up while Shanty's hand gently touched his as he did so. Vasper's face darkened, watching them closely, his emotions barely held in check. Jake moved to a distant, empty sofa, far from both the guardians and Vasper, and sat down with Chanty. The eyes of the guardians and Vasper followed them. "Jake, could Chanty stay at my mansion?" David asked. "There's a chance the Verdant envoys might visit, and if they see she's not under my care, they'll grow suspicious." Jake remained silent, staring at David. Chanty, too, looked at Jake, waiting for his response. She preferred Jake's mansion. Chanty then glanced at David, still avoiding Vasper's eyes, which pained Vasper deeply. "Jake," David called again, waiting for an answer. Jake nodded. "All right, David, deal." David continued, Chanty, if any verdant envoys come and ask about you and Vasper, you'll deny everything, right? Say you've never met him, not even once, and that you have no connection to Vasper Mondragon. Vasper clenched his jaw, glaring at David. Though furious, he knew Chanty had to comply. Chanty nodded in agreement. No problem, David, she said, for she, too, wished to deny her past with Vasper, to erase it if she could. Chanty, I want to see the Sword of Destiny, Vasper suddenly demanded, his voice serious. The guardians exchanged glances, surprised. Jacob, who had been watching earlier, now stared at Vasper in disbelief. He hadn't expected Vasper to make such a bold request. Justin and Louis chuckled, while others gazed seriously at both Vasper and Chanty. Jake, who understood Vasper's intention, remained silent, his gaze fixed on him. Chanty, however, didn't respond. She felt Vasper had no right to order her anymore and instead hugged Jake tightly, wanting Vasper to believe she was no longer pure. Vasper's anger flared, hurt by what he saw. David sighed deeply. Show me the sword, Vasper insisted again. Jake only looked at him, saying nothing, while Chanty continued to ignore Vasper, pretending he wasn't there. Jake, David urged, you know how important Chanty is to our mission. Don't forget that. His voice carried a hint of suspicion, though Gabriel already knew the truth. Jacob silently watched the scene unfold. Jake tightened his embrace around Chanty, who remained quiet. Vasper stood, intending to approach Chanty, but David blocked his way. Vasper, didn't we agree that you wouldn't get close to her? Keep your word, David said firmly, and the guardians, including Jake, grew alert. Chanty was determined not to show Vasper the sword. She had no obligation to explain anything. Jake, you answer Vasper's question, David instructed. Chanty suddenly turned to David. Why, David? Should Jake and I report everything we do to you? Isn't this normal for a couple? Besides, I'm tired of this Sword of Destiny. Can't I quit this obligation and give it to someone else? She said, tears streaming down her face. The guardians were shocked by her words, especially Jake, who looked at Chanty with compassion. David and Vasper remained speechless. Shouldn't you just leave me alone so I can rest from all of this? I'm so tired of this life, always hiding, never knowing where I'll end up, Chanty sobbed, collapsing into Jake's arms. The guardians panicked as Vasper tried to approach her, but Jacob and Louis quickly blocked his way. Vasper locked eyes with Jacob, who stood firm in his path. David got up and walked toward Chanty and Jake. Chanty had broken down completely, crying uncontrollably, while Jake held her tightly, kissing her forehead, cheeks, and lips, trying to comfort her. Chanty, please, that's enough, Jake whispered, and Chanty looked up at him, holding him close. Jake gently stroked her hair, kissing her forehead repeatedly. Vasper felt as if he were falling into a bottomless pit, overwhelmed by the weight of his emotions and the pain in his chest. He could only watch as Chanty was wrapped in Jake's embrace, realizing it should have been him by her side, not Jake. David, we'll go to the room, Jake said, and David nodded heavily, his heart burdened as he looked at Chanty. Jake and Chanty disappeared back into her room. Jake sat her on the bed. I'll get some water, Jake said, but Chanty clung to him. Don't leave me here, she whispered. Jake understood. Justin, can you bring some water? Jake called out, knowing Justin would hear him. Jake held Chanty close. I'm so sorry, my love. I wish there was something I could do to ease your pain, Jake said, gazing into her tear-filled eyes. I just want a normal life, Jake. Not this. I want to live in my own home, Chanty replied softly, her voice broken. Soon, Chanty. Your mansion will be finished soon, okay? Don't worry. I'll make sure it's done, and I'll take care of all the expenses, all right? Jake reassured her. Chanty remembered Vasper's promise to finish the mansion, but now it was Jake who would fulfill that role. She nodded, and Jake's face lit up with joy. Where do you want to live when we get married? Jake asked. Chanty paused, surprised. In my mansion, Jake, or in yours? "Either will be fine," she said, a small smile forming. Jake, overjoyed, kissed her on the lips. They were still kissing when Justin knocked and brought water. Jake opened the door, took the bottles, and glanced at Chanty before Justin left. Jake handed Chanty the water, and as they heard David sending Vasper away, it was clear Vasper didn't want to leave. That afternoon, Vasper never left David's mansion. He stayed in the living room all day. "What would you like to drink, Vasper?" David asked, out of respect for him. Vasper chose whiskey, and David called for Samuel to bring some. But it was Justin who remained in the living room while the other guardians were either in their rooms or outside the house. Justin glanced at Vasper, impressed. Despite the pain Vasper felt from seeing Jake and Chanty together, he still stayed, just to be near Chanty. Justin shook his head in disbelief, and Vasper caught his gaze. Neither of them spoke, and they quietly drank together. Vasper sat on the sofa, lips tightly shut. Eventually, Justin broke the silence. "David, when the Verdant envoys come, what if they ask about the incident at the restaurant in Paris?" It was obvious how Vasper chased after Chanty, and if Chanty denies ever meeting Vasper even once, wouldn't it be clear she's lying? Justin asked. David looked at Vasper. "That's what you'll have to handle, Vasper. You're in charge of the footage and the news station reporting it. Have them erase everything. After all, you own the building where the TV station is located. And about any public surveillance footage, you need to be more careful so we don't attract attention. Our identity must remain hidden," David added. Vasper stayed silent, continuing to drink, his ears attuned to the faint noise from Jake and Chanty's room. Even the softest sound of Chanty's voice was like music to him, despite the pain her words inflicted on his heart. He had accepted the consequences of his betrayal. All he wanted was to keep seeing her, to hear her voice. David and Justin exchanged glances as they watched Vasper. Eventually, David couldn't hold back anymore and asked, "How did everything turn out this way, Vasper?" "I'm sorry, but I can't help but ask. We're all shocked by how quickly everything changed. We just found out about Jake and Chanty's relationship, and we still can't believe it." David shook his head, his eyes full of confusion. Vasper looked at him, not wanting to discuss the incident any further, but he saw the curiosity in David's eyes. "Have you ever tasted magic wine, David?" Vasper asked abruptly. David thought for a moment. "I drank some when Samara visited me. Samara brought the wine. I was already drunk when Samara made me drink it, but I was still aware of what was happening around me. But by the time I realized what was going on, it was too late. I'm a fucking idiot. I couldn't teleport, and my body became normal. It was my fault for not leaving the room. I let my feelings take over, and, well..." Vasper trailed off, taking a long gulp of whiskey. Justin laughed. "And the worst part is Chanty saw the whole thing, didn't she?" Justin asked, looking directly into Vasper's eyes. Vasper clenched his teeth and stared at the whiskey bottle, his knuckles turning white as he gripped it. David glanced at his own glass, shaking his head. "Wow, Chanty's world really fell apart, Vasper. You can't blame her. Fate itself found a way to bring Jake into her life," David said. Vasper didn't like what David was saying. He glared at him, his fists clenched tightly. As much as it hurt, there was truth in David's words. It was all his fault. The three of them, Vasper, David, and Justin, continued drinking in silence until Vasper suddenly heard noise coming from Chanty's room. Both David and Justin noticed how alert Vasper became at the sound from Chanty and Jake's room. Chanty had fallen asleep, but Vasper could hear the sound of soft kisses and muffled moans between Jake and Chanty. He downed another glass of whiskey, his eyes burning. David glanced at him, concerned. "Vasper, you should probably go home. It's not good for you to be here," David said quietly. Vasper stood up abruptly, and both David and Justin stood as well, watching him carefully. Vasper looked up at the ceiling, letting out a deep, heavy sigh that echoed through the mansion. Even Jake and Chanty could hear it from their room. Their room suddenly went quiet. Justin telepathically warned Jake that Vasper could hear them, which only made Vasper more upset. His body language was tense, filled with anguish. "Jake, I want to go back to your island mansion. Let's swim in the ocean tonight, under the moonlight," Chanty said softly, though everyone in the mansion could hear her. Vasper stiffened at her words, his body going numb with rage. "Jake? Please?" Chanty added in a playful, seductive tone, one that made it impossible for Jake to refuse. "Come on," she said in a sultry voice. David and Justin grew more anxious, watching Vasper closely. "Louis!" David called out. Vasper's breathing became heavier, his face flushed with anger. "Vasper, don't forget our agreement, okay?" David reminded him as Vasper poured another glass of whiskey. "Okay, but bring your things, because you don't have clothes at the mansion," Jake said from the room. "Don't let them leave, David," Vasper demanded, turning to him. "David." "We'll be back in 3 hours," Jake's voice echoed from the room. David looked at Vasper but didn't respond, simply watching him. "Vasper, you can't keep doing this. Let Chanty go. Have mercy on her. Meanwhile, you have everything you could ever want. You have a child on the way," David emphasized. "No. I can't let her go. I can't. I'll lose my mind if I let her go," Vasper shouted through gritted teeth, tears streaming down his face. David, Justin, and Louis were stunned, their brows furrowed in disbelief. Outside, Gabriel, Marco, and Jacob exchanged worried looks, having heard everything with their heightened senses. They shook their heads at the tragic state of Chanty, Jake, and Vasper's entangled relationships. The room fell silent. Then, suddenly, they heard the sounds of Chanty packing her suitcase, preparing to leave with Jake. "Can't we just sleep there tonight?" "We'll come back at dawn, Jake," Chanty suggested. Those in the living room exchanged worried glances at what they were hearing. David couldn't refuse Chanty's simple request to Jake. Vasper took another gulp of whiskey. In the blink of an eye, Jake and Chanty's presence vanished. They had teleported to Jake's island. Vasper, overcome with fury, closed his eyes. "Vasper, keep your promise. Don't cause trouble, okay? I'm counting on you. If this conflict between you and Jake continues, I won't have any choice but to hand Chanty over to the Sylvan Concord." "I'm sorry," David warned. Vasper stared at him seriously, but didn't respond. Then, without a word, Vasper also disappeared. David and the others panicked. "This whole love triangle is a mess, David. What kind of problem have we gotten ourselves into?" Louis exclaimed. "They're both as stubborn as Jake used to be." "We can't control them," Justin added. Gabriel, Marco, and Jacob entered the mansion, looking just as worried. "Vasper's been drinking. Who knows where he went," Louis remarked. They were all concerned for Chanty's safety. David remained silent, deep in thought, feeling pity for Chanty, caught in the middle of two men who loved her fiercely. Meanwhile, Chanty and Jake materialized inside Jake's penthouse apartment in Paris, France. Chanty was startled, thinking they were heading to an island beach. "Jake, where are we?" Chanty asked, her wide eyes scanning the spacious room surrounded by gray blackout curtains. Jake smiled softly. "We're in Paris," he said, pulling her towards the curtains. As Jake swept them aside, a breathtaking view of the Eiffel Tower was revealed to Chanty through the glass wall of Jake's apartment. Chanty gasped at the sight, her mouth slightly open as she marveled at the towering buildings nearby, the busy traffic below, and the throngs of people bustling through the city streets. "Jake! It's so beautiful here, my God!" Chanty exclaimed, her eyes filled with joy and admiration as Jake smiled at her lovingly. "Chanty, I love you so much. It makes me so happy to see you this happy," Jake whispered, his voice soft and almost reverent. Chanty wrapped her arms around Jake and kissed him. They kissed passionately, their lips meeting with fervor. "Jake, I love you too, thank you," Chanty whispered back. "Wait here," Jake said as he moved to a cabinet. Chanty followed Jake with her gaze as he moved toward his closet. He returned, smiling, holding something in his hand. Chanty waited, curious. Suddenly, Jake knelt before her. In his hand was a velvet blue ring box, which he opened in front of her. Inside was a white gold ring, its center adorned with a diamond surrounded by blue sapphires. Chanty's mouth fell open as she stared at the ring, her hand covering her lips. Her eyes, wide with admiration, shifted between Jake and the sparkling ring. Her heart raced. She already knew what Jake was about to do. Jake, his expression serious, looked intently at her, though his hand, holding the ring, trembled slightly. He was nervous, unsure of how Chanty would respond, filled with uncertainty. Yet, he knew he had to do this now, especially with the looming threats around them, Vasper and the Sylvan Concord. There was an urgency in his plan. He needed to secure Chanty by his side. "Will you marry me, Chanty?" Jake asked, his hands trembling as he held the ring, his eyes locked on Chanty's, who was mesmerized by both the ring and Jake's gaze. Chanty's smile grew wide. "Yes. Jake, I will," she cried. Jake leaped up, shouting yes, in front of her. He quickly took her hand, sliding the ring onto her finger. Both of them gazed at the ring, especially Jake, who seemed overjoyed. Jake kissed Chanty's hand repeatedly before embracing her tightly, spinning her around the room. "Thank you so much," he kept repeating, his voice filled with pure joy. Chanty laughed, holding on to Jake's neck as he spun her around and around. Finally, he set her down gently. "I love you so much, Chanty Lorenzo. Are you ready to be my wife? For the rest of your life?" Jake asked, grinning. "Yes, Jake. I am." Chanty laughed, her happiness palpable. Jake's joy was immeasurable, as if he had been lifted to the heavens by his happiness. He was overwhelmed with gratitude that Chanty had said yes. He hugged her tightly again, and they kissed fervently, their bodies pressed against the glass wall. Jake led her to the bed and laid her down, both of them smiling. Jake removed his t-shirt, climbing on top of Chanty, who immediately wrapped her arms around his neck. Their bodies and lips seemed drawn together like magnets. Their passion intensified as Jake slowly unbuttoned Chanty's blouse, his fingers undoing each button carefully, their lips never parting. He unclasped her bra, removing it completely, leaving Chanty bare before him. Jake gazed at her with love and admiration for her beauty. Jake's hand caressed Chanty's breasts, and his lips captured one, drawing a soft moan from her as the pleasure overwhelmed her senses. His mouth returned to her lips, kissing her hungrily, his love for her pouring out in every kiss, every guttural groan that escaped his lips as he whispered, "I love you," over and over. Meanwhile, Chanty's hands moved to unbutton Jake's pants, her fingers undoing the zipper as Jake helped her remove both his pants and briefs. Chanty's hand eagerly wrapped around Jake's hardness, causing him to moan from the heat of her touch, his own hands working to pleasure her as well. As Jake removed Chanty's pants, her most intimate area was exposed to him. Chanty spread her legs before him, her body open and vulnerable, and Jake's hands tenderly caressed her with love. "You're so beautiful," Jake whispered as he knelt between her thighs, his eyes filled with awe. Chanty's body writhed from the sensation of Jake's touch, the heat of his hands igniting her skin. For several seconds, Jake simply feasted his eyes on Chanty's naked body, unable to believe that fate had granted him the woman he once thought was just an impossible dream. Jake's fingers played gently with Chanty's sensitive flesh, causing her to moan, her body arching in response to his touch. Chanty's hand covered Jake's, guiding him as he explored her body. Jake loved watching her, the way her entire body responded to him, the way her face showed the pleasure he was giving her. Chanty's sensitive flesh grew wetter, her desire building, as Jake lowered his mouth to her, kissing her tenderly, passionately, his love and hunger palpable. Both of Jake's hands climbed to Chanty's breasts as his tongue and lips danced between her thighs. Chanty moaned, her eyes closed as her hands gripped Jake's hair. Jake lifted his head briefly to kiss Chanty's lips again, whispering, "I love you so much," before gently biting her lower lip. Chanty's response was a deep moan of pleasure. Jake reached for a pillow, lifting Chanty's hips and placing it beneath her. Her body was fully exposed to him now, and Jake returned to worshipping her with his tongue, his movements faster and more intense as he felt her nearing climax. Shanty's moans grew louder as she called out Jake's name, her fingers tightening in his hair, spurring him on. Her breathing quickened, her lips parted, and her eyes closed, chasing the ecstasy of the sensations building inside her. Shanty's body trembled as she neared the edge, her muscles tensing. She pushed Jake's head further between her thighs, crying out his name in a guttural moan. And then it hit. Chanty gasped for air as her climax overtook her, and Jake kept his tongue firmly pressed to her sensitive flesh, ensuring she felt every wave of pleasure as the tingling sensation spread through her body. Shanty's body writhed on the bed like a serpent, consumed by the overwhelming pleasure coursing through her. And her grip on Jake's hair loosened. Jake looked up at her, his tongue still teasing her sensitive flesh. The sight of Chanty with her eyes closed, breathless, slowly catching her breath, sent waves of satisfaction through him. He gently licked away every trace of her, savoring every bit, even the sides, licking with care. Chanty let out a soft laugh, though weak, her body still trembling from the overwhelming pleasure Jake had drawn out of her. Her eyes fluttered open as she gazed down at him, watching as he continued to worship her body, taking his time, indulging himself. Jake's tongue slowed, yet it didn't stop, skillfully playing with her, reawakening the pleasure that Chanty thought had dissipated. Her lips parted slightly, her breath shallow, as she looked at him, their eyes locking as Jake's tongue danced upon her. Unable to resist, Jake playfully captured all of Chanty's sensitive flesh within his mouth, making her giggle again. Together, they shared that laugh, eyes shining with love and desire. "This is mine," Jake declared, his voice rough with possession and love. Chanty responded with a moan, nodding, her eyes filled with desire as they shared a silent conversation of love and devotion. Jake's tongue resumed its teasing, and Chanty's hand found its way back to his hair, while her other hand rested on Jake's, which was now caressing her breast. Minutes passed, her moans filling the room, and Jake's tongue moved faster, urging her toward another peak. Chanty's second climax surged through her, her fingers tightening in Jake's hair so hard that his man bun came undone, her hands falling weakly to her sides as her muscles trembled from exhaustion. Jake, still dedicated, gently licked her clean, his tongue slow and deliberate, until Chanty's sensitive flesh was left spotless. He climbed up her body, kissing his way from her belly to her breasts, alternating between them, his lips worshipping her body with passion and reverence. When his mouth reached her lips, the kiss was deep, demanding, filled with a fiery hunger and love that consumed them both. It was as if Jake was drawing out her very breath, their tongues dancing desperately together. "I love you, Chanty," Jake murmured between kisses, his voice low and filled with raw emotion. Chanty moaned in response, "I love you too, Jake." Their lips parted briefly, and Chanty raised her left hand, showing off the engagement ring that now adorned her finger. Jake smiled, taking her hand and kissing it, his lips lingering over the ring. His body, however, had already begun to move on its own, positioning itself above Chanty's. She could feel the hardness of his arousal pressing against her sensitive flesh, the friction sending jolts of pleasure through them both. They groaned in unison, their bodies responding to the intoxicating sensation. Jake's slow, deliberate movements made Chanty's legs lock around his hips, her arms wrapped tightly around his body. Their lips found each other again, and they moaned into each other's mouths as Jake increased his pace, his body trembling with restraint. He didn't want to break her innocence, so he kept their union just at the edge, their bodies sliding against each other, careful not to cross that threshold. As Jake's movements sped up, they both chased after the pleasure that was building between them. Chanty's nails dug into Jake's back, her arms tightening around him with every thrust, her moans echoing through the room. Jake's body stiffened, his control hanging by a thread. Chanty, overwhelmed by sensation, released Jake's lips to gasp for air, her head tilting back as Jake buried his face in her neck, their bodies moving together, faster and faster. Their moans blended in the room, a chorus of pleasure and desire. Jake's voice, hoarse, whispered her name over and over, while Chanty could only respond with breathless moans of Jake, as she clung to him. The seconds ticked by, and as their climaxes built, they both hit the peak at the same time, their lips locking once more in a desperate, all-consuming kiss. Chanty's eyes squeezed shut, her body shaking from the force of their shared release, their skin slick with sweat, as Jake's essence spilled over her belly, warm and thick. Their lips finally parted, their gazes meeting, eyes filled with a lingering haze of passion and affection. Sweat glistened on their foreheads, trickling down their necks, but there was a smile on both of their lips. "I love you," Jake whispered softly, brushing his lips against Shanty's once more. "I love you too, Jake," Chanty replied, her voice soft and filled with emotion as their kisses softened into gentle pecks. Jake slowly sat up, reaching for his shirt that had been discarded at the foot of the bed. He carefully wiped the sweat from Shanty's face, her neck, her breasts, his touch playful and filled with affection, making Shanty laugh softly. Jake then cleaned up his essence from her belly, his fingers tender as he made sure no trace was left. Yet, when it came to Shanty's sensitive flesh, Jake leaned down once more, using his tongue to clean her, ensuring she was left pristine. Shanty smiled, touched by his care. Jake picked up Shanty's lingerie, helping her slip back into it. His eyes followed every movement as Chanty lifted her hips so he could pull her panties back on, but before he could finish, he leaned down and kissed her sensitive flesh once more, playfully nipping at her. Chanty squealed at the tickling sensation, both of them laughing together. Next, Jake dressed himself, pulling on a fresh black shirt from the closet, while Chanty, now seated on the bed, watched him, still in her panties. Jake, mesmerized by the sight of her, took in her beauty, lingering as she sat there, looking at him with an affectionate smile. She stood up, ready to dress herself, but Jake immediately pulled her into a tight embrace, kissing her lips passionately. They shared a smile as they pulled apart, both of them glowing with love. Jake helped Chanty fasten her bra, his fingers brushing over her skin with tender care. Once they were both dressed, they stood together, gazing out at the Eiffel Tower, wrapped in each other's arms. They exchanged another soft kiss, both of them grinning like kids in love. "Let's head to the beach," Jake said with a smile, their eyes gleaming with excitement for their next adventure. When Jake and Chanty arrived at his mansion on the island, both stood frozen in shock, their eyes wide, as they were greeted by utter chaos. The inside of Jake's mansion was wrecked, everything from the sofa to the paintings that once hung on the walls lay shattered and strewn across the floor. Even the chandelier was broken. They stood there for minutes, mouths agape, taking in the scene that looked as though a tornado had swept through. The doors to the bedrooms were also destroyed. Jake's face remained calm, but his fists clenched, his mind already suspecting the person responsible for this, Vasper. There was no doubt about it. As Chanty began to walk towards the living room, Jake stopped her. He placed their luggage to the side, then, without a word, lifted her into his arms, careful of the shattered glass covering the floor. "Don't walk there, you'll hurt yourself. There's too much broken glass," he said softly, holding her close. Chanty wrapped her arms around his neck, looking into his eyes. "Jake, what happened? Did a storm pass through here?" she asked, confusion etched on her face. Jake shook his head. "Not a storm. Vasper. I'm sure he's behind this," he said, his voice laced with quiet determination. Shanty's mouth opened in shock, unable to find the right words. But she felt sorry for him. "Jake." "I'm so sorry," she whispered, but Jake silenced her with a kiss. They kissed deeply, passionately, and without letting her go, Jake teleported her, still locked in the kiss, towards the kitchen. When they pulled apart, they looked around, relieved to find the kitchen still intact. Everything was untouched. Jake gently placed Chanty on the floor and moved towards the refrigerator, checking for something to cook. A smile spread across his face when he saw that the fridge was still stocked. "I'll cook us dinner," he said, his voice lighter now, trying to bring back some normalcy. Chanty, though still worried about the state of Jake's mansion, looked at him with concern. "Jake," she started, wanting to comfort him, but Jake brushed it off. He knew Vasper all too well, and he didn't want to complain about it. "Don't worry, I'll have David come by tomorrow to help clean up," Jake reassured her. He pulled a stool for Chanty, but she didn't sit. Instead, she moved closer to Jake, wrapping her arms around him. "I want to help with dinner," she said, her voice soft, her embrace warm. Jake's heart swelled at her gesture, and he smiled, feeling like he could melt from her presence. They kissed again, long and sweet, pulling back only to laugh, as if the destruction around them didn't matter anymore. Chanty was focusing all her energy on Jake, especially now that they were engaged. She wanted to fully move on from Vasper, to forget him entirely, so that seeing him wouldn't affect her anymore. She wanted to erase every trace of him from her life. Jake pulled out the ingredients from the fridge and placed them on the center island, which was spacious, surrounded by tall stools. "All right, so teach me. What do I do? What are you making?" Chanty asked, grabbing a cutting board and knife. Jake grinned at her. "Well, tonight, you're my guest. You just sit and watch. I'll do all the cooking," he said with a wink. Chanty gave him a playful look. "Even in the kitchen, you have to show off, huh?" she teased, her voice dripping with affection. Jake chuckled, though her playful tone sent a thrill through him. "Show off? How?" he asked, biting his lower lip as he stepped closer to her, teasing. Chanty leaned against the table, watching as Jake moved closer, his gaze playful yet intense. "Of course, you want to do everything yourself while I just watch." "What else would you call that?" she murmured, but before she could finish, Jake grabbed her waist and pulled her against him. Chanty couldn't resist, and their lips met again, kissing fervently. Her arms wrapped around Jake's neck as he lifted her up, carrying her. "Let's go to the beach. We can cook later. I'm not hungry yet," Chanty whispered between their kisses. Jake laughed softly, not able to refuse her. In an instant, they were at the beach, the sound of the waves surrounding them. Chanty breathed in the salty air but was startled by the sight of Jake's sofas and furniture washed ashore by the tide. Some pieces had already dried under the sun. Jake sighed, shaking his head as he looked at the mess. One of the beds was even lying on the sand. Chanty's eyes widened in disbelief at what Vasper had done, but she didn't want to dwell on him anymore. Jake dragged the bed up to a large rock where it would dry faster under the sun. He moved the remaining furniture aside, clearing a space for them. Meanwhile, Chanty began undressing, her pants first, gazing out at the sea. Dusk was settling, and the moon had already appeared, casting a soft glow over the water. She removed her blouse and bra, standing bare-chested as Jake watched, mesmerized. He remembered the first time he had seen her under the moonlight, but now, she was his. She belonged to him, and no one else. Chanty threw her clothes onto the large rock and walked towards the water like a goddess, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, barely covering her breasts. Her nipples peeked through her hair, a tantalizing sight for Jake, who smiled, unable to look away. She waded into the water until it reached her waist, diving under, her body illuminated by the moonlight. When she stood again, the water only reached her feet, her beauty radiating even more as her wet skin glistened under the night sky. "Jake! Come on," she called out, her voice playful and inviting. Jake stripped off his shirt and pants, leaving only his briefs. His muscular body was a temptation Chanty couldn't resist, and as he approached, she met him halfway, their bodies magnetically drawn together. Chanty wrapped her legs around Jake, her arms around his neck, and he lifted her, carrying her deeper into the water, their lips locked in passionate kisses. Their bodies pressed together, hot with desire, as the cool water lapped around them, heightening their senses. Jake's mouth found Chanty's breasts, kissing and sucking on them as she moaned, holding tightly to him. The waves crashed around them, mingling with their sounds of pleasure. Jake's hands gripped Chanty's back in her waist, pulling her even closer. "I love you so much, Chanty. I'm so glad you're mine now," he murmured between kisses. Chanty moaned softly, her voice breathless. "I love you too, Jake. I'm yours, now and forever," she whispered, sending a rush of happiness through Jake's heart. The waves pushed against them as Jake held Chanty's naked body tightly, and she slid her panties off, letting the sea carry them away. Both now fully exposed, Chanty wrapped herself around Jake again, her body pressing against his hardness. The sensation was intoxicating, their desires blending with the night air. Chanty gasped as Jake whispered, "Thank you for agreeing to be my wife," his words heavy with emotion. Chanty moaned in response, "You're the only man I want to be with, Jake. Forever." Her words filled Jake with joy, and they shared another fiery kiss, as if they were trying to steal each other's breath. As their lips parted for air, Jake's mouth traveled down Chanty's neck to her breasts, worshipping her body with kisses and gentle bites. Unable to contain himself any longer, he teleported them to the bed by the large rock. Their wet bodies fell onto the mattress, Chanty beneath him, Jake on top, both completely naked under the moonlight, the waves crashing in the distance, with only the soft glow of solar lights illuminating their world. The crashing of the waves on the shore served as the background music to Jake and Chanty's shared happiness atop the bed. Their moans mixed with the roar of the ocean and the nighttime chorus of insects. Above them, the large, clear moon in the sky heightened the romance of the moment. Their bare bodies, intertwined and still warm from the pleasure they had just shared, glistened in the moonlight. They breathed heavily, struggling to catch their breath, as Jake repeatedly declared his undying love for Chanty. They kissed again, and in an instant, Jake teleported them to Chanty's room. It remained untouched by Vasper, and Jake silently thanked the heavens that they had a safe place to rest for the night. Together, they showered, rinsing off, but their bodies found each other once more in the bathroom. They again indulged in their shared love and joy, leaving both of them breathless after their intimate exchange. Jake knelt on the bathroom floor while Chanty straddled him, their breaths still rapid as they waited for their heartbeats to return to normal. They gazed deeply into each other's eyes, overflowing with love for one another. Chanty's arms were wrapped around Jake's neck, her fingers gently stroking his wet hair. Jake smiled up at her, his eyes brimming with adoration and admiration for Chanty's beauty, his heart swelling with the immense love and happiness he felt for her. He took Chanty's left hand and tenderly kissed her engagement ring, lingering there while gazing into her eyes. "Tomorrow, we'll tell David the news," Jake said, his voice and eyes gleaming with excitement. Chanty smiled back, equally thrilled, and they finished their shower together. Afterward, Chanty dressed in a seductive outfit, a sexy dress that barely covered her underwear, with spaghetti straps resting delicately on her shoulders. Her perfect figure and allure were on full display, tantalizing to Jake's eyes. They were alone in the mansion, so Chanty felt free to wear such a revealing dress in front of her fiancé. She wasn't even wearing a bra, and the shape and curve of her breasts were clearly visible through the fabric, making her appearance that much more tempting. Her seductive look that night was a first, meant only for Jake. Jake, seeing her, was visibly intoxicated by Chanty's beauty and allure, but he reminded himself that he needed to cook so they could eat that night. "You're so beautiful. If it were up to me, I wouldn't want to leave this room, but we need to cook," Jake said, laughing, which made Chanty giggle as she hugged him. Teasingly, she grabbed Jake's now hard arousal, and they both laughed together. In response, Jake playfully bit her neck, making Chanty scream in laughter, and then he lifted her from the room and teleported them to the kitchen. Once in the kitchen, Jake got to work on cooking, determined not to ask Chanty for help. Instead, Chanty hugged him from behind while he worked, resting her head on his biceps and wrapping her arms around him. Her hands roamed across Jake's abs and chest, tracing the lines of his muscles. Jake couldn't stop laughing, trying to maintain his composure and focus enough to finish cooking. "Oh, God!" Jake exclaimed playfully, his voice echoing through the kitchen, making them both laugh. Jake's body was heating up from Chanty's touches, so much so that he couldn't even slice the vegetables properly. Chanty admired Jake's skill with the knife. He moved like a master chef, quick and precise, but she continued to follow him wherever he went. When Chanty finally unbuttoned and unzipped Jake's shorts, he gasped. "There's no way I'll finish cooking at this rate." Jake muttered with a guttural moan, feeling overwhelmed by Chanty's torturous play. "Why won't you let me help you cook? I've got nothing else to do, so I might as well entertain myself with you," Chanty whispered teasingly in Jake's ear. Jake couldn't hold back anymore. He suddenly turned to face Chanty and kissed her fervently, his body burning with the heat that had been building up for so long. His hands roamed her body as he lifted her onto the kitchen island, their kisses demanding and consuming. "I love you so much, my love," Jake whispered against her lips. Chanty moaned in response, "I love you too, Jake." Jake laid Chanty back on the island, still kissing her. Chanty's arms wrapped tightly around Jake's neck, her fingers playing with his hair. Jake slid off her underwear, and Chanty helped him remove his shorts and boxers in one swift motion. Jake stood between her spread legs, their intimate parts pressing against each other. His hardness rubbed against Chanty's sensitive flesh, both of them growing louder with moans. Jake's mouth moved down to her neck, his hands kneading her breasts, his lips finding one to suckle on as his hips rocked against her, keeping himself just outside her entrance. Chanty was on the brink of madness from the pleasure, while Jake trembled, holding back from entering her as he treasured her virginity. They were both on the edge of climax, their breathing loud and fast, and Chanty, overwhelmed, lay back completely, her body shaking as she longed to surrender herself to Jake. As she reclined, Jake lifted her legs and draped them over his shoulders, kissing her thighs as he thrust against her. Chanty closed her eyes, gripping the edges of the island as Jake continued to rub against her. They were both chasing their climax, their moans filling the air, with Jake whispering Chanty's name. Chanty's mouth opened in a silent scream as her body arched, and Jake's eyes were locked on her, spurred on by the sight of her pleasure. Her dress had ridden up to her neck, leaving her body completely exposed to Jake's hungry gaze. Chanty's hands found Jake's, which were still gently massaging her breasts, full of love and care. Jake's pace quickened, and soon they both cried out as their pleasure peaked together. Jake groaned, his eyes squeezed shut as he released, his seed spilling onto Chanty's stomach. Chanty's body trembled with aftershocks as she collapsed back down. Jake lowered his head to Chanty's sensitive flesh, licking her clean until she was dry. He kissed her tenderly, making Chanty giggle, her legs still splayed open. Jake grabbed a kitchen tissue and wiped his release from her stomach before kissing her sensitive area again. Then he tugged Chanty's dress back down to cover her, pulling her hands to help her sit back up. They embraced tightly and shared a soft kiss. Afterward, Jake helped Chanty change into a fresh pair of underwear, and he put his own clothes back on as well. They smiled at each other, locking eyes. "Can I finally help you cook?" Chanty asked as Jake slipped on a t-shirt. Jake chuckled softly, still feeling the lingering warmth of their shared moments. He was about to start cooking, but before they could even begin, their lips found each other once more, drawn by an irresistible magnetic pull. Kisses followed kisses, their passion reigniting as they savored the closeness. It wasn't until after more than an hour had passed, with the food finally cooked, that they began eating. As they sat down to their meal, Chanty couldn't help but shower Jake with praise. "The food is amazing, Jake," she said with wide eyes, her voice brimming with admiration. She had tasted Jake's cooking before, but every time felt like the first time. His culinary skills were unmatched, and the deliciousness of his dish made it hard for her to stop eating. She took another bite, her eyes practically rolling back in delight. "It's so good I can't stop," she exclaimed, making Jake smile in sheer satisfaction. Seeing how much she enjoyed his food filled Jake with joy. He gently added more food to her plate, his gaze full of affection. Chanty, in return, grabbed a spoonful and brought it to his lips, feeding him with a tender smile. She did this several times, each time making Jake's heart flutter as he laughed softly, clearly moved by her sweetness. "This is amazing, Mr. Handsome." "Thank you for dinner," Chanty teased playfully, causing Jake to burst out laughing, his deep voice filling the kitchen with warmth and joy. "You're welcome, my love," Jake replied, his eyes shining with love. "Anything for you," he added as they locked eyes, their laughter echoing together in the kitchen. Amidst the playful banter, they couldn't resist sneaking in kisses, even while they were eating. The sounds of their shared laughter and light-hearted kisses filled the room, and in those moments, they felt nothing but happiness. They chose to ignore the wrecked state of Jake's mansion, with furniture and belongings shattered and scattered everywhere, courtesy of Vasper's destructive wrath. Even though the house looked like it had been ravaged by a storm, they didn't let it dampen their spirits. As their dinner stretched into the night, Jake reached over and gently lifted Chanty onto his lap. She raised her left hand, her eyes captivated by the sight of her engagement ring. The diamond sparkled brilliantly under the soft lighting, its beauty almost surreal. Jake, enchanted by how mesmerized Chanty was, couldn't help but smile as he watched her gaze at the ring. Leaning closer, he whispered softly into her ear, his breath warm against her skin, "You're going to be Mrs. Jake Valerian." His words sent a shiver down Chanty's spine, and she gasped as the reality of it struck her like a wave. It seemed like just yesterday that Vasper had told her she would become Chanty Mondragon. She had never imagined that everything could change so drastically, that Jake would fill the void in her heart left by Vasper. She stared at the ring in awe, the diamond glittering like a beacon of the love they shared. "Jake," she began, her voice trembling with emotion. "I love you." Her eyes locked onto Jake's, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Jake's gaze was equally intense, his eyes dark and intoxicated with desire and devotion. He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms tightly around her as he kissed her deeply, fervently. One of his hands gently cradled the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her hair as he held her in place. "I love you more, Chanty," he whispered between kisses, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he added, his words muffled as their lips continued to meet, again and again. Chanty wrapped her arms around Jake's neck, pulling him closer as their kiss deepened, lasting for what seemed like eternity. But while they were lost in each other's embrace, unaware of the world around them, Vasper was inside the mansion, lurking in one of the rooms on the ground floor. Hidden behind an invisible shield, his energy and presence were undetectable. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands, his fingers gripping his hair tightly. His gaze was fixed on the floor, his tears dripping silently onto the cold, hard surface. Vasper's mind was in turmoil, his thoughts clouded by pain and heartbreak. He had been there the whole time, ever since Jake and Chanty arrived. He had listened, watched, and observed from the shadows, the agony inside him growing with every passing second. His chest felt shattered, completely obliterated. There was nothing left of him but the wreckage of his emotions, broken and bruised, yet he couldn't stop torturing himself by staying. He bit down hard on his lip, fighting back the sobs that threatened to escape his throat. His teeth clenched so tightly his jaw ached, as if he had died 1,000 deaths that day. He couldn't understand why he kept coming back to witness his own suffering. "Vasper. You're Vasper Mondragon," he whispered bitterly to himself. "She's just another woman who passed through your life." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Chanty wasn't just any woman. She was the one. Tears continued to spill from his eyes as he stared at the wall, wiping them away furiously. From the kitchen, he could hear the sound of Jake and Chanty washing dishes together, their voices light and happy. Determination hardened Vasper's expression. His eyes filled with a dangerous resolve. He stood up, his movements sharp and precise, as he reached for the gun tucked at his side. This wasn't just any gun, it was designed specifically for beings with powers like him and Jake. He cocked the gun, teleporting directly to the kitchen where Jake and Chanty stood, facing the sink, their backs turned to him. The first thing Vasper noticed was Chanty's seductive dress, and the jealousy that burned in his chest reached its boiling point. His gaze turned murderous, his hand steady as he aimed the gun at Jake's back. At that moment, Vasper released his invisible shield. Jake and Chanty instantly sensed his presence, turning around in shock to find him standing in the doorway, the gun aimed squarely at Jake. Vasper's eyes blazed with rage, seething with jealousy and hatred. Chanty's body went cold, as if ice had been poured down her spine, but despite the fear, she instinctively clung to Jake, her body trembling in terror. Vasper's jaw tightened, his teeth grinding as he locked eyes with Jake. Jake's muscles tensed, his fists clenching at his sides, ready to defend himself and Chanty. "Vasper!" Chanty shouted, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You made a deal with David. You promised to honor the agreement, so why are you here? Don't you dare go through with this. I will never forgive you, Vasper." Her arms tightened around Jake protectively. Jake remained motionless, his eyes narrowing as he stared down Vasper, ready for whatever might come next. Vasper's gaze flickered to Chanty, and the pain in his eyes grew worse as he spotted the engagement ring on her finger. A tear rolled down his cheek as he stared at it, and his heart shattered all over again. Jake's arms wrapped protectively around Chanty's waist, but Vasper's gun remained trained on Jake, unwavering. "In 2 weeks, there's a race. I want to race you, Jake," Vasper said, his voice cold and deadly. "If you win, I'll leave you both alone. You'll never hear from me again. But if I win, you have to promise to give Chanty back to me." His words sent shockwaves through both Jake and Chanty. "No," Chanty cried, shaking her head in disbelief. "Jake, no. Don't agree to this. He's out of his mind, I'm never going back to him." Panic flooded her voice as she looked at Jake, then back at Vasper, her eyes filled with dread. "When will you let me go, Vasper?" Chanty shouted through her tears, her voice breaking. When will you give me peace? There's no hope for us anymore. No matter what you do, I'll never go back to you. Her tears streamed down her face as she clung desperately to Jake. Then I'll erase him from this world if you won't come back to me. Vasper roared, pulling the trigger. The gun fired with a deafening bang, the bullet crackling like lightning as it shot past Jake's ear, narrowly missing him. The bullet pierced through the concrete wall, passing through a tree trunk outside before embedding itself deep into a boulder. The entire island echoed with the sound of the gunshot, followed by Chanty's piercing scream. Jake's ears rang from the blast, but his first instinct was to shield Chanty from harm, holding her close as her body trembled uncontrollably in fear. Her face was pale, her expression one of sheer panic. "Jake?" Chanty's voice trembled as she looked at his face, noticing the blood trickling down from the small graze near his ear. "Jake, you're bleeding." Her hands frantically touched his neck and face, panic rising in her voice as she tried to assess his wound. Jake didn't move, his gaze still locked on Vasper. If Chanty hadn't been by his side, he would have already retaliated. But he couldn't leave her now. If he did, Vasper might take her again. Chanty, tears streaming down her face, clutched Jake's waist in desperation. "For God's sake. Chanty." Vasper's voice dripped with sarcasm as he surveyed the scene. "That's just a scratch. Come on, it's nothing. And believe me, that's not the worst Jake will face if he doesn't give in to what I want." Chanty's tears quickly turned to rage as she glared at Vasper, her whole body trembling. "You have no shame, Vasper. Go home to your family. To your wife." Her voice cracked, raw and loud. Vasper's face twisted into a grimace, his eyes darkening as they locked onto Chanty's. His voice dropped, each word laced with bitterness. "You know from the beginning, Chanty, it was always you I loved. Not Samara," he said through gritted teeth, his words slow, sharp, and cruel. The weight of his confession made Chanty's heart pound harder, but it only fueled her anger. Chanty let out a harsh, bitter laugh, her tears now replaced with fiery defiance. "I can't believe you'd say that to my face, Vasper." After everything that's happened, she shot back, her voice trembling with both hurt and fury. The room was thick with the unsaid, with buried emotion rising to the surface. "Because that's the truth. Chanty, I regret my mistakes from that time," Vasper said, staring intensely at her. But Chanty suddenly screamed, "Vasper! That's enough. There's nothing left to explain. Everything is over. I don't need it anymore. All I want is for you to leave Jake and me alone. Give me the freedom I gave you. I let you go because Samara is having your child. You're going to be a father. Focus your time and attention on them. Please, I beg you." Chanty cried out, her voice filled with desperation. Jake pulled her tightly into his embrace, his arms wrapping around her protectively. Vasper's pain was evident in his eyes, as if his entire world was falling apart. "All right, Chanty, I'll give you what you're asking for, but on one condition. Like I said before, Jake." Vasper's voice grew colder, his gaze fixating on Jake. "If you beat me in a race, I won't bother you both anymore. But if I win, you will give her back to me," Vasper shouted, pointing at Chanty. He placed his gun back at his side, his posture unwavering as he stared at Jake. Jake remained resolute, standing firm. "Jake, don't agree to this. Do you even race? Can you drive a race car? This is unfair." Chanty pleaded desperately, her eyes filling with tears. "Please, don't let him take me back. I won't go," she sobbed, clinging to Jake. Vasper's heart twisted in pain at her reaction, knowing how much she despised him now. Meanwhile, Jake, filled with compassion and understanding, softly stroked Chanty's hair, planting a gentle kiss on her lips. Seeing this, Vasper, burning with jealousy, swiftly drew his gun and fired it into the air beside Jake. Chanty screamed in fear, but Jake didn't flinch, his jaw clenched in silent fury. The sound of Vasper's gun echoed across the island. "I don't want to see the two of you kissing in front of me if you want peace, Jake," Vasper yelled, his voice shaking the kitchen. It was the first time Chanty had ever heard Vasper this angry. Jake shot him a sharp glare, and he was ready to strike, but Chanty tightened her grip on him, holding him back. Vasper stood firm, his gun still at his side, glaring at Jake. "Jake, no. Please," Chanty cried. Vasper's face twisted in bitterness as he watched the affectionate gestures between Chanty and Jake, gestures that used to be reserved for him. "If you don't agree to my terms, Jake, there will be no peace for either of you," Vasper warned, his eyes now on Chanty. "On the 30th of this month, meet me in Tokyo, Japan. Bring your car," he added. "No. Jake, don't agree," Chanty shouted again. "You don't even race, right?" she pleaded, her voice trembling as she begged Jake to refuse Vasper's challenge. "Jake, please." Chanty's voice softened, seductive, trying to sway him. Jake was captivated by her closeness, her body pressing against his as she touched his face lovingly. Vasper clenched his jaw, his jealousy boiling over as he watched the scene unfold. Just as Chanty leaned in to kiss Jake, Vasper cocked his gun. Jake and Chanty froze, their eyes snapping to Vasper, whose gun was now aimed at Jake. Jake gritted his teeth, locking eyes with Vasper. Fury blazed across Vasper's face, his whole body trembling with anger and jealousy. Chanty, furious and trembling, could barely contain herself anymore. "Didn't I tell you, no kissing in front of me?" Vasper bellowed, his voice filled with rage, his hand and body trembling uncontrollably. "Vasper! Leave us alone. I hate you!" Chanty screamed, her tears falling from the sheer anger in her eyes. Vasper's chest ached as he watched Chanty cry in frustration over him. "Is it so hard to understand that it hurts me to watch, Chanty? Are you that heartless? It feels like my heart is being torn apart every time I look at you too," Vasper shouted, the veins in his neck bulging as his rage overflowed. Chanty's fear intensified as she saw Vasper's trembling hand holding the gun aimed at Jake. She was terrified he would pull the trigger. "Vasper! Lower the gun," Chanty whispered softly, her voice shaking. Jake's body trembled as well. "You have no right to be jealous, Vasper. You and Chanty have no relationship anymore," Jake said firmly, his voice strong and unwavering. "Jake and I are getting married, Vasper." Chanty spoke quietly, hoping her calm tone would ease Vasper's tension and make him lower the gun. But Vasper's anger only deepened. He stared at Chanty, tears glistening in her eyes. "Can't we just go back to the beginning, Chanty? Forget what happened. I regret it all, it's my fault, but I can't live without you in my life," Vasper pleaded, his voice breaking with emotion. "Vasper, there's no going back. You have a child on the way and you're going to marry Samara. What more do you want? You're so selfish. You only think about yourself." Chanty cried out. "I'm happy with Jake. He's the one I want to be with for the rest of my life. We're getting married," Chanty pleaded. Jake wrapped his arms tightly around her again. "Please, don't let him get to you," Jake whispered to her, glancing at Vasper. Vasper, unable to contain his frustration any longer, looked up at the ceiling and let out a deep, anguished sigh. "Give me one good reason not to pull this trigger against his head, Chanty. I'm furious with Jake," Vasper shouted, his voice full of rage. Chanty panicked, while Jake was on high alert, worried for her safety. "There's no reason I should let him live," Vasper declared coldly, glaring at Jake with sharp, piercing eyes. "Vasper, please don't. I'm begging you, lower the gun. Have mercy. I love Jake," Chanty pleaded, her voice trembling. Jake was shocked by the depth of emotion Chanty revealed, all to protect him. But Vasper felt like he had been killed 1,000 times over by her words. "There will be no wedding," Vasper yelled. Jake and Chanty both looked at him, shocked. "I'd rather let the Sylvan Concord interfere than see the two of you get married," Vasper continued. Jake clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him, as he knew exactly what Vasper meant. "You know, Jake, Chanty cannot marry you, an ex-guardian. No wedding of yours would ever be honored in either the outer world or the inner world. Your marriage papers would be worthless, no matter where you go, Vasper sneered. Chanty furrowed her brows in confusion, her mouth slightly open as she turned to Jake, who was glaring murderously at Vasper. Jake pulled Chanty closer to him. "Jake, what does Vasper mean?" Chanty asked, her voice full of concern. Vasper smirked sarcastically. "Chanty, can you go up to David's place?" "I just need to talk to Vasper," Jake said quietly, but Chanty knew he had something else in mind. Vasper raised his eyebrows, challenging Jake with his gaze. Chanty began to panic, sensing the looming fight. She didn't want them to hurt each other, Jake, her future, and Vasper, the one she had buried deep in her heart long ago. She didn't want either of them to get hurt. It felt like she was trapped between two massive stones. "Jake, no. Can we just ignore Vasper? Let's go back to David's place." "You don't need to come back here," Chanty pleaded, but Jake's body was rigid with fury toward Vasper. Only Chanty's embrace was holding him back. She hugged him tightly, begging, "Jake, please, let's go." Vasper, still standing there, added, "Jake, the race." "Good luck, that's the only reason I won't mess with you too. I won't show myself to you again, if you beat me. But if I win, you will give Chanty back to me." Jake looked at Chanty, who shook her head in despair. "No," she whispered. "But if you don't agree, I'll hunt the two of you like a ghost," Vasper warned, lowering his gun and spinning it around on his finger, his eyes fixed on Jake and Chanty. "You're a nightmare in my life, Vasper. I regret ever meeting you. I hate you." Chanty whispered the words, but to Vasper, they hit like a thunderclap. Her words felt like arrows piercing his heart. Jake saw the pain in Chanty's eyes, and it hurt him too. He knew Chanty wouldn't be in this much pain if she didn't still have feelings for Vasper. The wounds Vasper had inflicted on her were still fresh, which was why she was suffering so much. It meant Vasper still had a place in her heart. "Jake, let's go. We can come back another day," Chanty said softly. "No. He should be the one to leave my mansion, Chanty, not us." Jake responded, his voice firm and full of determination. "After what you've done in my mansion?" Jake glared at Vasper. Vasper glared back even harder. "What happened in your mansion, Jake, is nothing compared to what you've taken from me," Vasper growled. Jake gritted his teeth, his eyes locked on Vasper. "Let's go, Jake, please." Chanty tugged on Jake's arm, but Vasper stood restlessly, unable to control his emotions and jealousy any longer. He let out a furious shout, punching the hanging cabinet above him. The impact was so strong, Chanty screamed in fear. "Jake, if you don't take me out of here, I might lose my mind. Please, let's go." Chanty begged, her voice trembling. But Jake was resolute. "No. Vasper is the one who should leave. Vasper, get out." Jake shouted through clenched teeth. Vasper stared back at Jake with deep pain in his eyes. "Mark my words, Jake, the final race in Tokyo. Don't forget," Vasper declared. "Leave." Jake screamed at Vasper. But Vasper remained defiant. Chanty, furious, suddenly released Jake and ran toward the door. Both Jake and Vasper were caught off guard by her sudden action. But Vasper, moving faster, grabbed Chanty's hand mid-run and pulled her into his arms. In an instant, they disappeared together. Jake stood there, shocked by how fast everything had unfolded. Panic gripped him as he clutched his hair in frustration, spinning around in rage. He screamed in anger, his voice echoing throughout the mansion and into the night, under the bright moonlight. Chanty hadn't taken Jake's black crystal earring, the one with a tracker. Without wasting any more time, Jake teleported to David's mansion, causing an uproar that night. Everyone was left scratching their heads in confusion. Vasper and Chanty materialized into a room, collapsing onto a soft bed, their bodies sinking into the plush fabric. Chanty lay beneath Vasper, who was on top, pinning her down. Desperately, she flailed her body, trying to escape his tight grip, her panic intensifying as she became acutely aware of her short dress and the absence of a bra. Vasper was wedged between her thighs, his presence suffocating. Let me go. You monster. Take me back to Jake. Chanty screamed, her voice shaking with fear as she struggled in vain against Vasper's strength. He remained silent, staring at her with a pained expression, unmoved by her pleas. Her energy was quickly depleting, her body weakening as she realized she couldn't overpower him. Their eyes locked, but all Chanty could think about was how vile the situation felt. Her mind flashed back to painful memories, recalling Vasper and Samara's bodies intertwined in passion. The revulsion surged anew, and she screamed louder, "Let me go! Jake! Help me!" Her voice echoed through the unfamiliar room, full of terror. "Please, be quiet," Vasper whispered, his voice sending shivers down Chanty's spine. He pressed his hips harder between her legs, and Chanty cried out in fear. "Let me go," she sobbed, her tears now streaming down her face. Vasper grabbed her wrists, pinning them above her head. Chanty panicked, her thoughts spiraling into darker places. "No, Vasper. Please, no. Let me go. Take me back to David, to Jake," she begged, her voice trembling as she stared into his eyes, which bore into her with intensity. "Chanty, I love you so much," Vasper said, his voice cracking. He seemed ready to say more, but before he could, Chanty spit directly into his face, her eyes blazing with fury. Her saliva dripped down his face, but instead of reacting with anger, Vasper froze, clearly shocked. They stared at each other, tension crackling between them. But then, to Chanty's horror, Vasper slowly licked the spit from his lips, his tongue sweeping over the remnants of her anger. In that moment, he looked impossibly handsome to her, an otherworldly beauty that only deepened her disgust. He grinned at her mischievously. "More, Chanty, do it again," he whispered seductively. His eyes flicked down to her lips, and she could see the hunger in them. He wanted her. Desperately. He wanted to kiss her again, like in the past. "I hate you. You're a demon," Chanty yelled, her voice breaking. Her tears flowed freely, spilling down the sides of her face, soaking the pillow beneath her head. Vasper's smile faded. "A demon?" he murmured. He reached for a large pillow and abruptly shoved it under Chanty's hips, elevating them higher and bringing their bodies even closer. Chanty gasped, fear racing through her as she felt the heat of his body pressing down on her more intimately. "No. Vasper, please, no. Have mercy on me," she screamed, her mind filled with terror at the thought of losing her virginity to him. She straightened her legs, trying to push him away, but his strength was like stone, unyielding. "Just one night, can't I have that, Chanty? Please, just one night," Vasper pleaded, his voice full of desperation. He pressed his face closer to hers, his breath hot against her cheek. "Ever since you left me, I haven't slept. You're all I think about. Every day feels like I'm dying from missing you. Vasper, stop it. I don't care. I don't want to hear about your feelings," Chanty cried, her voice rising with panic. "Take me back to Jake. And what about your wife, Samara? She's pregnant. Think about her. She's not my wife. That night, it was the wine. It was my mistake for not leaving. Stop. I don't need your explanations. I don't care. Just leave me and Jake alone," Chanty shouted, twisting her body again, but Vasper's grip was unbreakable. His rage flared when he heard Jake's name again. Without warning, he reached for Chanty's hand and forcefully yanked off her engagement ring. Chanty screamed in panic, trying to hold on, but Vasper pried it from her fingers with ease. "No. No." Chanty screamed, tears of frustration and helplessness streaming down her face. "You demon. I hate you, Vasper. I hate you," she sobbed, her voice breaking under the weight of her despair. Vasper's face darkened as he took the ring and threw it across the room, the sound of it clattering against the floor echoing ominously. "I won't let you go back to him, Chanty. I won't," he whispered, his lips brushing against her neck as he buried his face there. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, filled with pain, lust, and hopelessness. Both were trapped in the intensity of their emotions, Chanty's fear and hatred, and Vasper's longing and possessiveness. The intoxicating scent of Chanty's skin overwhelmed Vasper's senses, a sharp reminder of what he longed for but could never claim without her consent. Chanty, sobbing uncontrollably, was on the verge of losing her voice, feeling helpless for both Jake and herself. Vasper, raising his head, let his gaze fall on Chanty's breasts, their shape clearly visible beneath the fabric of her dress. Chanty's panic was palpable, tears streaming from her eyes as she sensed the growing hunger in Vasper's stare. The tension in the room thickened as she felt the undeniable hardness of Vasper's arousal, the heat from his body fueling her fear and dread. But Vasper's eyes shifted toward the side table, where an old bottle of wine rested, one he had kept hidden for a long time. To prove my point, Chanty, there's the wine I drank that night. His voice trailed off, but Chanty's eyes followed his, fear gripping her. The wine bottle was unlabeled, and the sight of it made her heart race even faster. She looked back at Vasper, dread pulling in her stomach, not understanding why she felt so terrified of that bottle. "Do you want to drink from it?" Vasper's voice was challenging, daring her. Chanty's pulse quickened as panic took over. "I won't drink anything you give me, Vasper," she said resolutely, her voice firm despite her fear. Vasper's lips tightened into a thin line. "You don't believe my explanation, so I'll give you a taste of it. Then you'll know if you can resist your own feelings," he said, his voice laced with frustration. Chanty's body tensed with fear, distrust clouding her every thought. She twisted again, trying to escape his grasp, but his body was immovable, as solid as a wall. "Give me back my ring, Vasper," Chanty demanded, her voice as calm as she could make it, despite the storm of emotions inside her. She forced herself to stay composed, knowing that panic wouldn't help her now. Vasper, however, remained unfazed. "The ring I gave you suits you much better than Jake's," he replied, his voice equally calm. His words sliced through the silence, causing Chanty to freeze in disbelief. "You're truly a demon, just like your father." "You're all demons," she spat, venom dripping from her words, her lips curling in anger. Vasper's expression darkened as he leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. "Do you want me to show you just how much of a demon I can be?" he whispered, his voice low and dangerous. Chanty's heart pounded so violently in her chest that she feared it might burst. "I want to be a demon tonight, Chanty," his whisper sent chills down her spine. "Do you know how I feel right now? Like there's a volcano inside me, waiting to erupt," he murmured, his tone both seductive and threatening. Chanty could barely breathe, her panic suffocating her. "My legs, they've gone numb," Chanty said, her voice trembling. "My legs hurt." Without hesitation, Vasper shifted his weight, releasing her legs so she could straighten them. Chanty felt a brief surge of relief as her legs stretched out, but Vasper's eyes roamed over her body, his gaze lingering on the curves of her legs as she moved. His hold on her wrists loosened slightly. Sensing an opportunity, Chanty acted quickly. She bolted from the bed, attempting to escape, but Vasper was faster. Before she could get far, he caught her again, forcing her back onto the bed. This time, he secured her between two large pillows, her legs spread despite her efforts to resist. Vasper positioned himself between her thighs once more, the weight of his body pressing her down. "Just one night, Chanty, all I ask is for one night where I can sleep beside you." Vasper's voice was almost pleading now, his face buried in her neck. Chanty didn't respond. She couldn't. Vasper began, but Chanty cut him off, her voice sharp and cold. "Shut up, Vasper. You disgust me." Her words hit him like a dagger. "I'm going to marry the man I love." Vasper froze, his eyes widening in disbelief. Chanty's voice, strong and unwavering, pierced through the tension in the room. "Nothing, not even you, can stop me from marrying Jake." Her declaration was final, resolute. "Do you really love him that much?" Vasper asked, his voice strangely gentle, his eyes searching hers for any hint of doubt. "Yes, I love Jake," she answered without hesitation, her eyes firm with conviction. Vasper looked down, the weight of her words sinking in. "Don't worry, I'll let Jake win the race," he said quietly. "I'll lose on purpose, and after that, I won't use my healing power," no matter what happens to me. You and Jake will be free. I won't bother you again." Shanty's blood ran cold at his words. She stared at Vasper, shocked by the gravity of his promise. Was he serious? Could he really mean it? "That's the only way I can forget you, Chanty," he continued, his voice soft, his eyes now brimming with tears. "If I let time go by and you marry Jake, I won't survive. It feels like dying over and over again every day. I can't stay away from you while I'm still alive." Tears began to spill from Vasper's eyes, and Shanty's own tears flowed harder, her chest tight with a pain she couldn't explain. She turned her head to the side, unable to look at him, unable to face the raw emotion in his eyes. "The only way I can give you happiness is if I die in that race," Vasper whispered, his voice cracking. "That's the only way I can set you free." Shanty sobbed silently, the weight of his words crushing her. Her chest ached with a sorrow she couldn't release. She had wanted freedom, but now the price of it seemed too heavy to bear. In just a few minutes, Chanty was pushing Vasper away again, trying to break free from his grasp. "Vasper, can't we just separate peacefully? You know, without any hard feelings, without anyone getting hurt," Chanty said, though she avoided looking into Vasper's face. Vasper, on the other hand, was staring at her cheek and neck. He was restraining himself, fighting against the overwhelming temptation that Chanty stirred in him. He longed to shower kisses on her neck, to feel her entire body pressed against his. His body trembled with the heat he was feeling. But Vasper remained silent. Chanty, sensing the heavy silence from him, still didn't dare to look at his face. She knew he was staring at her. She tried to move, but she still couldn't. The weight of Vasper's body held her down. Her eyes darted around the unfamiliar room. She noticed the large closet by the wall, looking for a clock but found none. Then, Vasper let out a groan and shifted his body. His hard desire pressed firmly against her sensitive skin, with only the thin lingerie and his pants separating them. Chanty felt a surge of anger at what he was doing. She abruptly turned her head towards him, her eyes blazing. "You demon! Get off of me, Vasper! You have no right!" Chanty screamed, her voice filled with desperation. She struggled to fight him off, but Vasper's gaze remained fixed on her face, intoxicated by her presence. His face showed a longing so deep, a thirst for her love that seemed eternal. "God knows how much I want you right now. Please, don't move. Just help me and stay still. Because if you keep struggling, I don't think I'll be able to stop myself," Chanty, Vasper whispered, his voice trembling with desire as he breathed heavily. "Vasper, your problem is simple. Take me back to Jake and go home to your wife. Let your feelings out with her. Why are you holding them back? Do it with your wife, not with me, because I am not your girlfriend. Jake is the one who has the right to my body, not you. Please, just take me back," Chanty replied firmly, her voice laced with frustration. Vasper's eyes darkened with anger at her words. "Mention Jake's name one more time, Chanty, and I'll rip off your panties," he threatened, his voice cold and stern, his jaw clenched. Chanty trembled with fear at his threat. She was angry, but she couldn't show it, terrified that he might follow through on his words. "I hate you," Chanty whispered, her voice barely audible as tears streamed down her cheeks. Their gazes locked, Vasper's intense and burning with a dark need. To Chanty, despite his good looks, Vasper seemed like a devil. She couldn't bear to look at him anymore, disgusted by his violation of her privacy and rights. "Who will you choose? Jake's life or mine?" Vasper asked, his question cutting through the tension. Chanty was stunned by his words. "I meant what I said earlier, Chanty. If I lose the race, I'm gone. You'll be free. But you can only choose one of us, me or Jake. I don't have to choose between the two of you, Vasper. Jake and I, we are together." "You are not my boyfriend," Chanty retorted quickly. Vasper's eyes narrowed as he bit his lower lip, and then he did something Chanty hadn't anticipated. He grabbed both of her hands with one of his and yanked up her dress, pulling down her lingerie as if to undress her. Chanty screamed, no, as tears flowed uncontrollably. Vasper, no. Please, no, she cried, sobbing desperately. Vasper stopped, his hands freezing in place as he slowly pulled her underwear back up. Chanty continued to cry, her sobs filling the room. Vasper struggled with the pity he felt for her, hardening his heart and his expression. But deep down, he was more pained by the situation they were in. Once, Chanty had given him her entire heart, her entire body had belonged to him. Now, everything had changed. He no longer had any right to her. Someone else was making her happy now. Vasper changed his grip on her hands, clasping them tightly as their palms pressed together. Chanty had given up fighting, her tears still streaming down her face. I'm sorry if I've gone mad over you. There's no other woman in my mind but you. You're the only one I want, Chanty. Only you. Didn't I tell you not to let go? Why did you let me go? Vasper whispered, his voice soft, almost pleading. He squeezed her hand tightly, and suddenly Chanty fell silent, her eyes slowly meeting his. I saw you and Samara on the bed. You were both naked. The sounds of your moans still echo in my ears. And you expect me not to let go of you? What do you think of me? Are you that insensitive? That day, I was ready to go back. But what did you do? Well, I guess I had no right, right? You and Samara were together first, weren't you? I was just the one who came late. Chanty's voice was filled with hurt, and Vasper could feel the sting of her words. I know how you feel, Chanty. I understand the pain because I felt the same when I saw you on Jake's Island. I saw you both, at the beach, on the bed by the shore. Vasper's voice broke, and Chanty looked at him in shock. At that moment, I wanted to shoot him, Vasper confessed, his tone sharp with bitterness. The sounds of your moans, they're still in my ears too. It should have been me making you moan, not him. Chanty felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. I heard everything in the kitchen. Your entire conversation. It felt like I died 1,000 times right then, seeing and hearing you together. But I didn't leave because I couldn't bear to be away from you, Vasper continued, his voice pained. But Chanty's expression hardened. Jake and I, she hesitated, remembering not to mention his name. We are together, Vasper. You have no right to be jealous. We're not in a relationship. We never were, she clarified. So please, let me go. What do I have to do to prove to you that I love you, Chanty? Please, tell me, Vasper pleaded. Nothing, Vasper. Because there's nothing left between us. I've moved on, I'm with Jake now. We're engaged. What more do I have to do for you to understand? Chanty's voice wavered, her eyes filled with desperation. Please, just let me go. Give us peace. Vasper simply stared at her. I'll see Jake at the race. Then I'll give you your peace, he said with resolve. That's not what I want. We don't need to go through all this, Vasper. Just understand and give me what I'm asking for, Chanty begged. But Vasper's mouth remained closed, his eyes stern. Leave you? I can't do that as long as I'm alive. You'd have to kill me first, he stated coldly. Chanty let out a deep sigh of frustration. You're impossible. Like a child who refuses to understand, she muttered, though Vasper heard her. Suddenly, Vasper leaned down and gently bit her neck. Chanty's breath caught in her throat, but no sound escaped her lips. Sorry. Vasper whispered softly, but Chanty's anger flared. Remember this, Vasper, you have no right to touch me like that. What you're doing is vile. Get off of me. Chanty snapped, her voice sharp with disgust. Let me go. I can't sleep with you there. She tried pulling her hands free, but he still held her down. Cover my face with a blanket, Vasper. I don't want to see you, she demanded, turning her head to the side with her eyes squeezed shut. But Vasper stayed silent, burying his face into the curve of her neck. Chanty could feel his hot breath against her skin, every inhale echoing in the silence. Inside her mind, she kept repeating Jake's name like a prayer. "Save me, Jake. Please come and find me." Over and over, until exhaustion took over, and her body gave in. Despite her best efforts to stay awake, her eyes fluttered closed, and she drifted into sleep. Vasper noticed when Chanty's body relaxed, her hands limp in his grasp. He watched her, mesmerized by her peaceful face. Slowly, he rose from the bed, careful not to wake her. As he stood up, he was tortured by the sight of her nearly bare body, the hem of her dress pulled up to her waist, revealing her delicate, sensitive skin through the sheer lingerie. His body heated with desire, beads of sweat forming on his forehead and neck. Her arms were still raised, exposing her flawless underarms, tempting him with the thought of kissing them. The jealousy within him burned. Jake had taken everything from him. It should be him, not Jake, who had the right to hold Chanty. Vasper pulled off his shirt, now only wearing pants. But then, suddenly, a bright circular light pierced through the wall of the room. Vasper's eyes widened in shock as he instinctively moved towards Chanty. Just as he was about to take a step, he found himself suspended in midair, unable to move. Out of the light stepped Jake, his expression fierce as he took in the sight of Vasper, half-naked and poised to approach Chanty, who lay vulnerable on the bed. In a swift motion, like lightning, Jake lifted Chanty into his arms. Chanty woke up with a start, her eyes wide in surprise. "Jake," she screamed, throwing her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. Chanty sobbed as she clung to him, while Jake kissed her lips, full of longing and worry. "It's okay, I'm here." "We're going home," Jake whispered. Chanty glanced back at Vasper, still suspended in the air, fully conscious of everything happening but powerless to move. He could see and hear, but he was completely immobilized. Without a second glance, Jake carried Chanty through the glowing portal, and they disappeared, the bright hole in the wall ceiling behind them as Vasper crashed to the floor. Vasper screamed out in frustration, slamming his fists into the ground as tears of rage and helplessness streamed down his face. "Jake! Where did you take her?" he roared into the empty room, his voice echoing. His body shook with uncontrollable fury. How had Jake gotten a flash hole tracker? That device was not something just anyone could get their hands on, it was reserved for members of the Sylvan Concord Council. Vasper's eyes flared with determination. He quickly changed back into his shirt and teleported to David's mansion. But when he materialized, the house was empty and eerily silent. He teleported again to another one of David's properties, but there was no one there either. Panic started to settle in as he teleported to Jacob's mansion, only to find it deserted. "David! You can't do this to me!" Vasper shouted into the void, clenching his fists and grinding his teeth. "Jake! Where did you take Chanty?" Desperate, Vasper rushed back to his own mansion, teleporting straight to his vault. His movements were swift and precise as he grabbed an invisible bag, filling it with crystals for trade, currency in the inner world. He gathered his weapons for self-defense, pulling a rubber band to tie his long hair back. "No. They won't take you away from me, Chanty. I won't allow it," Vasper muttered as he frantically prepared for his next move. "I'll never forgive you, David." Vasper knew exactly where they would take someone as important as Chanty. There was only one place, the Sylvan Concord. Meanwhile, Jake and Chanty found themselves in the VIP room, an isolated sanctuary nestled within the ether, suspended precariously at the boundary between the inner and outer worlds. Chanty clutched the long coat Jake had given her, his warmth still lingering in the fabric as if it alone could shield her from the storm to come. They had arrived here through a flash hole tracker. Outside, the tension in the air was palpable as David stood locked in a private meeting with the Verdant envoy. This was a situation Jake could not control, a devastating choice set in motion by Jacob, who had alerted the Sylvan Concord to their dire predicament involving Chanty Lorenzo. The very same envoy had provided Jake with the flash hole tracker, making it possible to find Chanty with unsettling precision. But now, the weight of that fateful decision bore down on Jake and Chanty like an iron vice. If the Sylvan Concord ruled against her, Chanty would be torn away from the outer world, confined to the Sylvan Concord sanctuary deep within the inner realm for 3 long, soul-crushing years. 3 years in isolation, with only one visitor allowed each year, someone of her choosing, a rare but hollow reprieve. Chanty trembled in Jake's arms, her tears soaking his chest, and he clung to her with equal desperation, as though sheer force of will could protect her from the encroaching shadow of fate. "Jake, the ring," Chanty whispered through her sobs, her voice breaking like glass. "How are we supposed to get it back from Vasper? He threw it in his room." Her words trembled in the silence, a plea shrouded in fear. Jake's jaw clenched, his pulse thrumming with barely contained fury. The thought of Vasper's audacity ignited something primal within him, a fire that threatened to consume him whole. "Don't worry about that. I'll get it back," he promised, his voice a low growl. "I'll tear that place apart if I have to." They lay together on the oversized bed, the silence between them thick with unspoken fears. Jake studied Chanty's tear-streaked face, the sorrow, love, and longing etched deeply in her eyes, reflecting his own torment. Their separation had only just begun, but already it felt like an eternity. "We only have 1 month left here in the outer world before they take you away," Jake said softly, his words heavy with finality. "Before they lock you in the sanctuary, let's get married, Chanty. I want to be your husband before they take you from me." Chanty's tears fell even harder, her chest heaving with emotion. Jake reached up, gently wiping away her tears with his fingers, kissing her forehead, her cheeks, and finally pressing his lips to hers in a tender, aching embrace. "We'll find a way," he whispered, but even he knew how hollow the words sounded. "Jacob's the one who reported us. If we're caught by the Sylvan Concord, it won't just be us. The Guardians will be punished too. I understand why he did it, but that doesn't make this any easier." Chanty's heart twisted painfully. She understood Jake's reasoning, understood the danger they all faced, but the thought of being torn away from him for so long was unbearable. "I'll miss you, Jake," she whispered, her voice a fragile thing on the verge of breaking. "A year without you feels like a lifetime. And we can only see each other once a year." Her words trailed off as she buried her face in his chest, the weight of their inevitable separation crushing her. Jake's grip on her tightened, his lips brushing against her neck, her face, trying to pour every bit of unspoken emotion into each kiss. Their love, fragile and defiant, swelled between them, desperate to defy the cruel fate awaiting them. But even in this moment, there were limits. The sanctuary's rules were ironclad, kisses were allowed, but nothing more. Their desire, their yearning, was trapped beneath the suffocating weight of those unbreakable laws. "Chanty," Jake's voice hesitated, the question on his lips one he dreaded to ask. "What did Vasper do to you?" His words were quiet, but the fear and jealousy behind them were impossible to hide. Chanty shook her head, her hands gripping his shirt as she looked up at him, her eyes pleading for him to believe her. "Nothing, Jake. He didn't hurt me. He just detained me. Forced me to stay. Please, don't worry. Nothing happened between us." Jake's muscles tensed, but her reassurance soothed him, if only slightly. "He kept talking about Samara, about wanting to race you. He said he'd let you win, but Jake, I don't trust him. Don't take his challenge. He's a professional racer, and you know he won't play fair." Jake's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. "I won't back down if he insists. I'm not a racer, but I've driven enough to know how to hold my own. He's not the only one with skills." Chanty blinked in surprise, a glimmer of hope breaking through the gloom. "Really?" she asked, and when Jake nodded, a soft smile spread across her tear-streaked face. They kissed again, tenderly, as if each moment was slipping through their fingers like sand. Suddenly, a sharp knock echoed through the room, shattering the fragile calm. "Jake, it's time to go," Justin's voice called from beyond the door. Reluctantly, they pulled apart, standing as one, their hands still locked together as they braced themselves for what came next. One last kiss. One last moment before the storm truly descended. When they opened the door, the sight of 6 solemn guardians greeted them, their expressions heavy with the weight of what was to come. Jacob's guilt was palpable in his eyes as he looked at Chanty, unable to meet her gaze. David and Justin mirrored his regret, their faces drawn with remorse. "I'm sorry, Chanty," Jacob whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't have any other choice. David stepped forward, his tone somber. It was either this, or the entire Sylvan Concord would come for us. I'm sorry too, but this was the only way. Shanta's silence was louder than any words she could have spoken. She wasn't angry, how could she be? But the weight of her impending imprisonment suffocated her, and nothing anyone said could ease the burden. David's voice cut through the stillness again, this time laced with urgency. We have a lot to sort out in this next month. Chanty, your businesses, your affairs, they all need to be settled. And starting tomorrow, the Verdant Envoy will be shadowing us. They'll be everywhere, watching. Be prepared. The walls of Shanta's world were closing in. Every word, every glance felt like a nail driving her deeper into her fate. Jake's arms encircled her again, and in a flash, the Guardians surrounded them, their hands resting on Jake's shoulders. In the blink of an eye, they teleported, leaving the sanctuary behind and reappearing in David's secluded mansion in the mountains. For a moment, Shanta stood dazed, glancing around at the familiar room. The Guardians sat quietly, their faces drawn and weary, while David explained. We're here because it's safer. The Verdant Envoy won't draw attention in the mountains. We're away from prying eyes. Chanty nodded absently, her gaze falling on a photo of her father hanging on the wall. Jake followed her, taking her hand gently as the Guardians exchanged uneasy glances behind them. David rose to his feet, his expression hardening. I'm going to retrieve Samuel. Jake, you're coming with me. Jake turned to Chanty, kissing her once more, his lips lingering on hers as if trying to imprint this moment into his soul. I'll be back soon, he whispered, and with that, he and David vanished. As Chanty watched them disappear, she walked slowly toward her room, her heart heavy with the weight of everything happening. The Guardians exchanged glances, unsure of what to say. Jacob stared at the floor, guilt eating away at him, while Gabriel and Jacob exchanged a silent, knowing look. Louis, Justin, and Marco sighed, frustration and helplessness settling over them. Chanty, now alone, prepared a bath, exhaustion creeping into her bones from the ordeal with Vasper. Her mind kept returning to the events of that day, her thoughts swirling with memories of Vasper's face, his presence haunting her even now. But she pushed it all away, focusing on Jake. Being with him helped her forget, if only for a moment. But when she was alone, the shadow of Vasper loomed, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Once the bath was ready, she undressed, slipping into the warm water. The fragrant essential oils relaxed her tense body, and she closed her eyes, leaning back against the tub. She scrubbed her skin vigorously, wanting to erase any trace of Vasper's touch. As the warm water enveloped her, she let her thoughts drift, but Vasper still lingered at the edge of her mind, a ghost haunting her heart. After a few minutes, Chanty heard David and Samuel's voices from the living room. She also heard Lorena. Her eyes lit up upon hearing Lorena's voice. Had Vasper already returned Lorena to David's mansion? Did that mean Vasper was at David's mansion? Shanta's heart raced, fearing that Vasper might suddenly appear again. Suddenly, Jake appeared in the room. From where she was standing, Shanta saw him. She smiled while looking at Jake, who was gazing back at her. Jake stood tall, his magnetic presence amplified by his hair falling to his shoulders. His smile and the playful glint in his eyes made him even more handsome. Shanta teasingly beckoned him with her fingers, but suddenly, she noticed Jake's eyes' expression changed as he looked beside her. Chanty turned her head quickly and saw Vasper. It was too late. Vasper had already lifted her effortlessly out of the bathtub. Before Jake could react, Chanty and Vasper were gone from his sight. Jake let out a scream so loud it sent the mansion's guardians into a panic. They rushed to Shanta's room, only to find Jake standing there, his face filled with defiance and fury, glaring at them. Jake's face turned red with anger. David instantly understood what had happened. Everyone groaned and cursed under their breath, blaming Vasper. Jacob punched the wall of Shanta's room, leaving a hole. David glanced at Jacob, and then said, "Louis, call the Verdant Envoy. Let them find Chanty. Leave it to them." Without delay, Louis rushed out of the mansion and boarded the invisible flying device parked outside. Meanwhile, Jake, overwhelmed with rage, disappeared, teleporting. David and the others began preparing for the actions they'd take once the Verdant envoy came to apprehend Vasper. Meanwhile, Vasper and Chanty teleported into a room where everything was almost completely white. He placed her down with care, and although she was still unclothed, Chanty immediately started hitting Vasper's chest and face, shouting in fury. "You bastard! You have no shame! Take me back to Jake! Take me back to David's mansion, Vasper," she screamed, her nakedness unimportant in her rage. Vasper didn't defend himself from her attacks. He stood still, lips sealed, allowing Chanty to slap and hit him over and over. Chanty kept crying, and eventually, her nails scratched Vasper's cheek, causing blood to trickle down. It was only then that Chanty stopped, seeing the blood drip from Vasper's face. Vasper looked at her with eyes filled with tenderness and love. Realizing her own nakedness, Chanty hurriedly covered her breasts and retreated to the wall, using both arms to shield her chest. "You have no shame, Vasper," she screamed. Vasper walked to a small closet, pulled out a towel, and approached Chanty, handing it to her. Chanty snatched the towel and quickly wrapped it around her body. She ran away from Vasper, who watched her, his heart aching at how much she now avoided him. "Vasper, take me back to David's mansion. Please. Enough. Stop making me angrier with everything you're doing." Chanty's voice quivered as she scanned the room, looking for an escape. But there was no door, no window, just cabinets and drawers. She clutched the towel tightly, retreating to a corner. There was no bed, no chair, only her and Vasper in this enclosed, box-like space. Slowly, Vasper approached her. "Don't come near me," Chanty yelled, her voice sharp with fear. Vasper's face showed visible pain. "Chanty, I won't let the Sylvan Concord take you," Vasper declared. Chanty's eyes widened in shock. "Because of you. They're coming for me because of you. If you hadn't kept meddling with me, I wouldn't be in this situation." Chanty's voice broke, tears streaming down her face. "It's your fault," she sobbed. Vasper wanted to come closer to her, but Chanty's defiance wouldn't allow it. Especially since she was naked, not even wearing underwear. "Vasper, take me back to David's mansion. I don't even have panties on." Chanty sobbed, her fear of Vasper clear. "Take me back, please," she begged, but Vasper, more frustrated than she was, gripped his long hair in desperation, pacing back and forth. "They'll take you to the inner world. We won't ever see each other again if they take you there, Chanty. I can't enter their sanctuary. I have no power there." Vasper's voice was filled with desperation. Chanty, stunned by Vasper's words, couldn't believe what he was doing. "Vasper, we have no relationship. Why are you acting like this? If you really loved me, you'd let me go. Give me my freedom, my happiness. That's all I ask." Chanty pleaded, her voice cracking with the weight of her emotions. "You said you'd give me to Jake if you lost the race. Now's the time, Vasper. Even if it's not through racing, please, just let me go." She begged him with everything she had. Vasper stopped, his gaze serious as he looked at her. "Chanty, I can feel it. You still love me. I can see it in your eyes, even though you're angry. I can feel it, but you're fighting it, denying yourself," Vasper said softly. Panic washed over Chanty as Vasper came closer. "No. Stay right there, Vasper. Don't come any closer," she shouted. In a hurry, she flung open 2 closet doors and used them to shield herself from Vasper's approach. "Why are we denying our feelings when we love each other, Chanty? Can't we be true to what we feel?" Vasper asked, his words hitting Chanty like a blow. She couldn't believe the audacity after everything that had happened, especially after what she had witnessed about him and Samara. "Vasper, wake up. You're delusional. You're not in my heart anymore," she lied. "Jake is the man for me. Go back to your family. Shanty's heart pounded with anxiety as Vasper continued to come closer, his face soft with longing and love. I never realized you were such a good liar, Chanty. You lied to me, to yourself, and to Jake. You don't love him. What you feel for him is pity, because he was there when I wasn't, Vasper retorted, his jaw tightening as Shanty's words sank in. She clenched her fists, furious. I'm not like you, Vasper. I love Jake. And I'm going to marry him, not you. You're delusional. You think you can have any woman you want. You can't accept that I don't want you anymore? Does it hurt your pride? Your masculinity? You can't stand the fact that I chose Jake over you? That's your problem. It's not love. Chanty screamed, her voice filled with rage. Vasper gritted his teeth, unable to accept her words. In a swift motion, he tore the closet doors away, pulling Shanty's body toward him. I love you, Chanty. That's the only reason. What you're saying isn't true. Vasper held her waist tightly with one hand, his other hand gripping her face, forcing her to look into his eyes. Shanty's face was frozen in place, her hands clinging desperately to the towel to keep it from falling. She could feel the heat of Vasper's body against hers. He pressed her against the closet, lifting her with one arm. Vasper positioned himself between her legs, pushing his body against hers despite her lack of underwear. Shanty's eyes widened in shock, but she couldn't move. Vasper had trapped her, his arm wrapping around her, locking her arms in place. She had one hand free, which she used to hit him repeatedly. You have no shame, Vasper. Let me go, she sobbed, but Vasper didn't respond. I've never lied to you, Chanty, but you're lying to yourself, to me, to everyone, Vasper whispered. In a surge of fury, Chanty spat in Vasper's face. For a moment, both of them froze, as if the world itself had stopped turning. Vasper didn't flinch, but instead, he licked the spit off his face near his lips. I haven't tasted that in so long, Chanty. I want more. Can I have more? Vasper asked seductively, sending shivers down Shanty's spine. In terror, she screamed for Jake. Jake. Please, find me. Help me, Jake, she cried. Vasper's face darkened at the sound of Jake's name. Desperately, he captured Shanty's lips in a forceful kiss. Chanty struggled, twisting her head away to avoid him, but Vasper held her cheek tightly, forcing her to stay still. She refused to open her mouth, clamping her lips shut, but Vasper suddenly yanked her towel down, leaving her exposed. He cast the towel aside effortlessly. Chanty gasped in shock, and at that moment, Vasper's tongue slipped into her mouth, exploring her. God knows how much I've missed you, Chanty, he whispered against her lips. Chanty bit down hard on his tongue. Chanty, fueled by fury, bit down hard on his tongue. Their kiss came to an abrupt halt, both frozen, but Vasper let her continue, enduring her bite as long as she wished. Chanty dug her teeth deeper into his tongue, fully aware of the pain she was causing him, yet Vasper silently bore it. Eventually, Chanty surrendered, releasing him. Without a word, Vasper moved his mouth to her breasts, suckling on them hungrily, switching between one and the other. Chanty screamed, no. No. But Vasper was consumed by his emotions, the overwhelming longing for her taking control. His lips trailed along her neck, burning with desperation, hunger, and love. Chanty, I love you so much. You're mine, aren't you? No one else can take you from me, ever, Vasper declared, his voice trembling with the intensity of his feelings. I love you so much, he repeated, his body shaking from the heat of his sweat and the force of his passion. His love and yearning for her overflowed in that moment, leaving him vulnerable. Chanty, desperate to escape Vasper's hold, summoned the sword of destiny into her hand. The glowing blade materialized, and Vasper stared at it, wide-eyed, as she's holding it. Let me go, Vasper. Now, she demanded. Do you think you can harm me with that, Chanty? Vasper challenged. Go ahead. Kill this man who's been bothering you, so you won't have any more problems. I'm right here, right beside you. Stab me with it, and all your troubles will end. His taunt was laced with a twisted invitation, his eyes locked onto hers, daring her. Tears of rage welled up in Chanty's eyes. She knew deep down she couldn't do it. Sobbing uncontrollably, she was overwhelmed by the helplessness of her situation. Go on, Vasper. Continue what you're doing to me. I have no more interest in finishing my mission, so I no longer have a reason to endure this life. Chanty said. I'm tired of hiding, I'm so tired, she whispered to Vasper, tears flowing from her eyes. Vasper, as if doused with ice water, awoke from the depths of his conflicting emotions. Overcome with intense compassion, he looked at Chanty, guilt consuming him for what he had done. Her face showed exhaustion and the loss of hope. Vasper's heart ached for her, for the suffering she endured. Vasper, what have you done? Wake up, he silently screamed at himself. But Chanty no longer resisted, the sword of destiny vanished from her hand. In that moment, she surrendered everything to Vasper, no longer willing to fight. Whatever fate had in store for her, she no longer cared. She was too exhausted from constantly hiding, constantly running from those who hunted her. Vasper felt Chanty's submission, her body giving up. She stared into his eyes. Do whatever you want to me, Vasper, until you've had enough, satisfy yourself, Chanty challenged in a soft, daring tone. Vasper's heart clenched. Chanty. Forgive me, Vasper whispered as he pulled her into a tight embrace. Forgive me, he repeated, his breath hot against her ear. Yet, he didn't let her go. I love you so much, more than I love my own life, Vasper continued, gazing into Chanty's face, her eyes filled with tears. Forgive me. I was only driven by how much I missed you. Since the moment you left me, I've thought of nothing but being with you again, kissing you, holding you close again, Vasper confessed, now sobbing. His own tears fell as he continued, I'm madly in love with you. He gently touched Chanty's cheek. She felt the warmth of his hand, and though it stirred familiar sensations within her, she no longer wanted to go back to what they once had. Nothing could change her decision. Jake was the one who had given her peace of mind, and she didn't feel any guilt. But I want you to know, Chanty, that you are the only woman I've ever loved like this. Forgive me for my mistakes against you. Nothing has changed about my dream of being with you as long as I live, without the shadow of Alexander Mondragon. I have no intention of ruining your mission. I only want to be with you, to have you by my side always. To see you with my own eyes every moment. I can't find peace if I don't see you near me, Vasper said, his voice low, husky, filled with emotions overflowing from his heart. Chanty remained silent, tears still flowing. She wanted to believe Vasper's words, but the memory of him and Samara in bed, consumed by their wild passion, shattered any hope. Can't you come back to me? Let's get married, Chanty, let's go through with our wedding, Vasper pleaded, his voice like that of a child lost in a dream. His face was filled with hope. He stroked Chanty's lips, his mouth and lips dry with longing, but he restrained himself. Vasper, Samara is pregnant. After she gives birth, you'll marry her. How can you even say these things to me? Chanty asked, the pain in her voice sharp as Vasper's words pierced her heart. No. Don't say that, Chanty. It's not true. What happened with Samara was just a setup by her parents to save their family's reputation. Part of the deal is that we'll divorce after the wedding. There's no emotional attachment, I've arranged everything before we start again. Samara's family understands, and she won't interfere with us anymore, with me, Vasper explained, reading the emotions in Chanty's eyes. Please, come back to me. Please be mine again. I'm begging you. Please, let's start over, Chanty, please. Listen to your heart, Vasper said, his gaze shifting to Chanty's chest, the sight of her exposed breast a torturous temptation before him, stirring his entire body and senses. I am the one in your heart. I don't believe Jake has replaced me there. I am still there in your heart, right? Please, let's begin again, Vasper continued. Chanty's tears slowed, but her gaze remained serious, fixed on Vasper. Hand me the towel, Vasper. She whispered under her breath. Without hesitation, Vasper teleported them to where the towel lay on the floor beside them. He gently placed Chanty on the ground. She grabbed the towel and quickly wrapped it around her naked body. Vasper watched her every move, intoxicated by his yearning and desire for her, yet holding himself back as much as he could. Vasper reached for Chanty's hand to hold it, but she gently pulled away and clutched her towel. "Vasper, I'm cold. I want to change," Chanty said softly. Vasper looked at her, then said, "Come on, let's go to the island beach. Your clothes are there." His voice held a hint of excitement, but Chanty wasn't excited at all. "My clothes are at David's mansion, Vasper," Chanty replied, and Vasper's smile faded. But he nodded. "Come, so you can change," he said quietly, extending his hand for her to hold so they could teleport. Instead, Chanty took hold of the hem of Vasper's shirt. He felt hurt but stayed silent. They teleported and materialized in a room on the island beach. Chanty stood silently, overwhelmed by the sight of the room. It felt unfamiliar now, a place that once was paradise for her, for both her and Vasper. Vasper watched her intently, his eyes following her movements and her expressions. Chanty didn't complain, knowing how stubborn Vasper could be. She avoided looking around the room, avoiding the sight of the bed they once shared. But she noticed her things were still there, untouched. She walked toward the cabinet, still familiar with where she kept her clothes. She opened it and found everything as it was. She pulled out a set of joggers and underwear. Vasper smiled as he watched her. But his smile vanished when Chanty entered the bathroom to change. Vasper waited outside, anticipating Chanty's return. Chanty hurriedly changed, her eyes catching a glimpse of their underwear, a painful reminder of their last passionate night together. The ache in her chest intensified. She felt as though the wound in her heart had been freshly reopened. She quickly left the bathroom, eager to escape the memories of their past. Vasper greeted her with a faint smile, but Chanty, though her heart pounded fiercely, maintained her composure. She couldn't help but glance at the bed, where she saw the dress she had worn the last time she stayed in this house. She immediately averted her eyes. Vasper observed her every reaction, and Chanty, her voice soft, said, "Vasper, I want to go back to David's mansion." Vasper didn't respond at first, seeming to sink under the weight of her request. "Let's have dinner here, Chanty. I'll cook your favorite dish," he said, his voice filled with quiet desperation. "We can watch the sunset this afternoon," he added, as if in a dream. Chanty felt cold water pour over her soul. Vasper was daydreaming, and she wanted to wake him from it. "Vasper, please, I want to go home." She paused, unwilling to speak Jake's name, fearing it would upset Vasper even more. Vasper didn't speak, but his breathing grew heavier, and he forced himself to keep a calm face. "Do you want cappuccino? I can make some," he offered. "No. I don't want anything except to go back to the mansion," Chanty replied, her voice growing firmer. "Would you prefer we have dinner on the yacht?" Vasper asked again, clinging to the hope of keeping her near. Chanty's tears started to flow as she looked at Vasper. Both of them were in pain from their situation. She was hurting for him, hurting for all that had happened between them, but most of all, she hurt at the thought of not escaping Vasper's life. In her mind, she called out for Jake, desperate for him. "I'm here on the island, Jake. I'm here. Please, come get me," she prayed silently, over and over. "Chanty, please stay with me, just for tonight. I want to share a meal with you," Vasper begged. "I'll take you back to David after, but please, just for a little while," he pleaded. Chanty hardened her heart, afraid that her own feelings would betray her again. She feared being swayed by her emotions, pitted by Vasper, or worse, tempted to fall for him once more. More than anything, she feared herself. "Vasper, take me home. And burn all my things here," she said quietly, looking him in the eye. Vasper stared back at her, his gaze serious. "These things will remain here until their rightful owner returns," he said, his voice cold. Chanty fell silent, unwilling to argue further. "Where did you put my ring, Vasper? Can you give it back to me?" she asked, her voice gentle. She hoped he would return her engagement ring from Jake. But Vasper's face grew even more serious, his lips pressing together, his fists clenching. Chanty felt her pulse quicken, sensing the shift in his emotions. "I threw it into the ocean," Vasper said flatly. Chanty froze. Her tears threatened to fall again, but she held them back, refusing to give in to him. But Vasper, seeing the pain in her eyes, felt the sting of his own heart. He knew she was hurt because Jake's ring was gone, and it was as if a knife had plunged into his chest. "Vasper, take me home," she said again, regaining her composure. "I'll cook in the kitchen," Vasper muttered, turning to leave the room, closing the door behind him. Chanty stood there, tears falling freely now. Her anger at Vasper boiled back up inside her. In her fury, she grabbed her belongings from the bed and threw them to the floor, screaming and crying. She ripped everything from the cabinet, tossing her clothes in a fit of rage. Vasper heard her but chose to ignore it, focusing instead on preparing dinner in the kitchen. He refused to acknowledge Chanty's outburst. Her sobs echoed in the room as she collapsed onto the floor, exhausted. "Jake, come get me," she whispered through her tears. "Please, take me away from this hell." "I'm here, Jake, please," she cried, over and over. Suddenly, Chanty heard the crash of glass from the kitchen. Vasper was raging too, smashing cups and plates. Chanty stopped crying for a moment, her tears still flowing, as she listened to Vasper's fury. She heard the sound of splintering wood as Vasper punched the kitchen cabinets, the force of his anger breaking them apart. She couldn't take it anymore. Chanty bolted out of the room, running out of the house, desperate to escape Vasper. She ran barefoot along the beach, not daring to look back, her only thought to get as far away as possible. "Jake! I'm here, Jake! I'm here on the island," she screamed, her voice breaking with desperation as she ran. Vasper, his face etched with agony and grief, teleported in front of her, blocking her path. Chanty spun around, only to see him appear again in front of her. They stood facing each other, both broken. Then, suddenly, Jake materialized in front of Chanty. Like magnets, Jake and Chanty embraced each other the moment they saw one another. Chanty clung to Jake, her arms wrapped tightly around him as tears of joy and relief poured from her eyes. Jake hugged her back, holding her just as tightly, and they kissed passionately, fervently. "Thank you, you're here," Chanty whispered, her voice full of gratitude and happiness. They kissed again, deeply, and Jake held her close. The sight of them together shattered Vasper's heart. He stood frozen, unable to move, as if waking from a deep sleep. His vision blurred as tears filled his eyes, and he watched helplessly as Jake and Chanty disappeared from sight. Vasper stood there for a long time, feeling empty, soulless, and numb. The day turned to night, then to the dead of night. And on the beach, the body of a man lay motionless in the sand, his feet washed by the waves. Vasper lay there, unmoving, surrounded by empty bottles of alcohol.